There is something about certain places on this earth that the human body recognizes before the conscious mind catches up. You step into a particular valley, or you stand at the foot of a particular mountain, and something deep in your chest shifts. Not fear exactly, not awe exactly, something older than both those words. Something that bypasses language entirely and speaks directly to whatever part of you remembers being small and fragile, and surrounded by a world you could not explain. Mount Shasta does that to people. It has been doing it for thousands of years. Travelers passing through Northern California describe pulling over on the highway without quite knowing why, sitting in their cars and staring at that white peak rising against the blue, feeling like they are being watched, feeling like something is waiting, feeling like the mountain knows they are there. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Tonight we are going all the way in. We are going to follow every thread, every geological anomaly, every oral tradition, every suppressed survey, every unexplained acoustic phenomenon, every piece of evidence that something ancient exists beneath that mountain, something sealed away long before the first pyramid rose out of the Egyptian sand, something that predates every civilization we have ever put a name to. We are going to spend hours inside this mystery, and by the time the last story is told, I think you will understand why certain researchers who have spent their careers studying pre-Columbian North America describe Mount Shasta as the single most anomalous site on the entire continent. Let us begin where all true mysteries begin, not with the strange, with the ordinary. Mount Shasta sits in Siskiyou County in the northern reaches of California, close to the Oregon border. It rises to 14,179 feet. It is a stratovolcano, which means it was built up over time through successive layers of lava and volcanic ash, each eruption adding another skin to the mountain. The most recent significant eruption happened roughly 200 years ago, though geologists classify the mountain as active, meaning the furnace beneath it is still running, still capable of what it has done before. Surrounding it is a landscape of dense conifer forest, glacial lakes, hot springs bubbling up through the rock, and long valleys of volcanic soil so dark it looks almost black in the early morning light. On a clear day, you can see Shasta from more than 100 miles away. It simply rises out of the horizon like a white fist, unmistakable, singular. The indigenous peoples who have lived near this mountain the longest call it by several names depending on the group. The Wintu, who are perhaps the oldest continuous inhabitants of the region, have a name for the mountain that translates roughly as the one who is alone, or the great one who stands apart. The Modoc people to the northeast have their own traditions about Shasta. The Karuk further to the west, the Shasta people themselves, who carry the mountain's name or perhaps gave it, have stories about the mountain that their elders describe as very old. Not old in the way that human memory is old in the way that stone is old. Before we go deeper into what lies beneath, we need to understand what we mean by ancient in the context of North America, because this is where mainstream archaeology and the physical evidence begin to pull in different directions. The accepted timeline of human habitation in the Americas has been revised more than once in the last 50 years, and each revision pushed the date further back. The Clovis culture, named for a site in New Mexico, was for decades considered the first evidence of human presence in the Americas, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago. That consensus began to crack in the 1990s when researchers at Monteverde in Chile produced evidence of human habitation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, possibly older. More recent excavations at sites in South Carolina, Texas, and the Yucatan have pushed potential dates of human presence back even further, some estimates reaching 20 to 30,000 years ago, a few outlier findings suggesting even earlier possibilities. What this means for Mount Shasta is significant. Because if humans were present in North America far earlier than we once assumed, then the oral traditions of the peoples who have lived near Shasta for generations are not simply mythology. They may be cultural memory. They may be the compressed, encoded record of real events so distant in time that they have taken on the texture of sacred story. But underneath that sacred texture are facts, geographic facts, geological facts, facts about what this mountain has done and what may exist within it. The Wintu have a story about the mountain that one of their elders, a woman named Adelaide Tabor, shared with a California ethnographer in the 1920s. Adelaide was very old at the time of the interview, and she spoke slowly, choosing her words with a precision that suggested she was being careful not to say more than was meant to be said to outsiders. She described the mountain as hollow in a particular way. She said her great-great-grandmother's grandmother had been told by her own grandmother that there was a fire inside the mountain that was not fire, that there were chambers inside the rock that had been made by hands, not by the volcano, that the people who made those chambers were not her people, were not any people her ancestors had ever spoken with face to face, but that the old ones who came before her oldest ancestors had traded with them sometimes, had exchanged things at specific places on the mountain's lower slopes, and that eventually those exchanges had stopped and the mountain had closed. Adelaide used the word closed specifically. She was asked what she meant. She said the mountain decided to close. The researcher who documented this assumed it was metaphor, and perhaps it was, but perhaps the word closed was the most accurate word available in the translation. Perhaps it described something real. We will come back to Adelaide's account. We will come back to it multiple times tonight, because each section of this story adds another layer of meaning to what she said. Let us start with the geology, because the geology is where the first cracks in the conventional explanation appear. Mount Shasta is not a simple volcano. Even by the standards of the Cascade Range, which includes other famous peaks like Rainier, Hood, and the now transformed St. Helens, Shasta is geologically unusual. One of the most striking features is the network of thermal springs and fumaroles distributed across and around the mountain. Most volcanic peaks have thermal activity concentrated near the summit or along specific rift zones. Shasta's thermal activity is different. It is distributed, which geologists describe as diffuse hydrothermal output, and it follows a pattern that does not match what you would expect from a standard magma chamber sitting beneath a straightforward cone. Stewart Valley Hot Springs, McCloud River Hot Springs, Burst Arse Falls, Mossbrae Falls, the springs at Black Bear Lake, the thermal seeps along the Upper Sacramento River corridor. All of these are connected in ways that hydrologists have been working to map for decades. And the mapping keeps producing the same uncomfortable question. Where is all this thermal water coming from? The expected answer is the magma chamber, but the distribution does not fit that model cleanly. The pattern is too regular, too organized. It suggests that the water is moving through a network of channels rather than simply percolating up through fractured rock in the random way that standard hydrothermal systems behave. In 1987, a pair of researchers from the US Geological Survey named Roland Price and Constance Mayer spent an extended field season mapping the thermal anomalies around the mountain's lower slopes. Their preliminary report, which circulated internally before a modified version was published, noted that the distribution of surface thermal expression was, quote, inconsistent with the known structural geology of the volcanic edifice. They recommended further subsurface investigation. That recommendation was not followed up in any published study for over a decade, and when research did resume, it focused on hazard assessment rather than the structural question that Price and Mayer had flagged. The question they flagged was simple. If the thermal channels do not follow the expected fracture patterns of a volcano that formed the way Shasta appears to have formed, what do they follow? One possibility that has been raised in geological circles but rarely explored in peer-reviewed literature is that the thermal network follows pre-existing cavities in the rock, large cavities, the kind that could only exist if either the mountain formed around them or if something created them in the time between major eruptions. Lava tube systems are well documented in volcanic geology. When lava flows over the surface and the outer skin cools and hardens, the inner lava can continue flowing and eventually drain out, leaving a hollow tube behind. Some lava tube systems are enormous. The Kazumura Cave System in Hawaii runs for more than 65 kilometers. The Jeju Lava Tube System in South Korea is similarly massive. In Iceland and the Canary Islands, lava tube networks reach depths and lengths that continue to surprise researchers who explore them. Mount Shasta has confirmed lava tubes on its flanks. The question that the geology raises, and that no one has fully answered, is how deep those tubes go and how they connect. In 2003, a small team of spelunkers from the Oregon Cave Research Association attempted a systematic survey of the known lava tube entrances on the southern flank of Shasta. They documented 11 distinct entry points, 5 of which had not appeared on any previous survey. Of those 5, 3 were quickly determined to be small and did not warrant extended exploration. 2 were different. One of the 2, which the team designated entry point 7 inches their field notes, had an airflow coming out of it that was notably warm, and that carried a faint mineral smell. The team leader described as sulfurous, but also something else, something he could not identify. The passage descended steeply, and the team followed it for about 90 meters before equipment limitations and concerns about air quality stopped them. They noted that the passage was widening as it descended, not narrowing, which is the reverse of what most surface lava tubes do. They filed a report with the National Speleological Society. They recommended further exploration with proper equipment. They were never able to return as a team. The lead spelunker, a man named David Fortner, died of a heart attack in 2006. 2 of the other members moved away from the region. The fourth, a woman named Carol Benson, gave a brief interview to a regional outdoor recreation publication in 2009 inches, which she said she had tried to find entry point 7 on a return visit and could not locate it. She assumed she had simply gotten the coordinates wrong. She did not rule out that the entrance had been obscured by a small slide. She said she thought about that cave sometimes. She said it had a feeling to it. She said she knew how that sounded. We do not have Carol Benson's full testimony. We do not have David Fortner's field notes, which passed into his family's possession after his death and have not been made publicly available. What we have is the report filed with the NSS and the brief interview, but they point towards something that the geology also points toward: a large, deep, internally complex system of cavities within the mountain that the surface evidence hints at, but that no systematic investigation has yet fully mapped. Now let us step back even further. Let us go to the oldest layer of this story. Let us go to what the land itself remembers. Northern California in the period before any human presence we can currently document would have looked dramatically different from the landscape we know today. The last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, covered much of the higher elevations of the Cascade Range in ice sheets that in places were hundreds of meters thick. Below the ice, the lower valleys were cold and dry, swept by winds coming off the glaciers, supporting a vegetation community that was more like the modern subarctic tundra than anything you would recognize as California today. Mammoths and mastodons moved through those valleys. Horses, which had evolved in North America and would later go extinct there, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears considerably larger than any bear alive today, dire wolves, animals that your imagination has to work hard to hold because they belong to a world that no living person has ever seen. In that world, Mount Shasta was already enormous, already active, already venting heat through its flanks, which would have been one of the warmest and most thermally stable environments in a landscape otherwise locked in cold. Near volcanic thermal springs, the temperature of the water and the surrounding rock would have remained above freezing even during the deepest winter. Plant life would have clustered around those springs. Animals would have been drawn to them, and any people present in the landscape would have known about them. There is a concept in archaeology called a refugium, a place where life concentrates during periods of environmental stress. During glacial advances, refugia become extraordinarily important because they are where populations survive that would otherwise perish. The thermal areas around Mount Shasta could easily have functioned as a refugium during the last glacial maximum. Warm ground, warm water, plant life surviving in a bubble of relative warmth surrounded by ice and tundra. If people were present in North America 20,000 years ago or earlier, as the growing body of evidence suggests, the thermal refugia around Shasta would have been among the most critical survival sites on the continent. Generation after generation might have returned to those springs, year after year, for thousands of years, accumulating knowledge of the mountain in ways that no other site on the continent would have inspired. The mountain would have been, quite literally, the source of life in a frozen world. And if the mountain had cavities accessible from the surface, those cavities would have been inhabited, not briefly, not seasonally, year-round, for thousands of years. What would people do in a mountain cave for thousands of years? They would do what people do in any long habitation. They would live. They would build. They would modify their environment. They would adapt the space to their needs. They would carve and shape and smooth and channel water and create drainage and pile rocks and build walls and mark surfaces. They would create a place. The question that follows from this is whether any trace of that creation survives inside the mountain today. Whether the geological evidence and the oral traditions are both pointing at the same thing, a series of chambers, deeply buried within the volcanic rock, that carry the marks of human inhabitation from an era before any civilization we currently recognize. This is not a fringe question. It is a question that follows directly from taking the geology and the indigenous oral traditions seriously, which are two things that responsible research requires. Let us now look at those oral traditions more carefully, because they are richer and stranger and more detailed than most people realize. The Wintu people's traditions about the mountain do not simply say that something lives inside it. They describe a relationship between the mountain and the people who lived before the Wintu's own ancestors arrived in the region. The Wintu call these earlier people by a term that translates roughly as the old makers or the ones who shaped things. These are not spirits in the conventional sense. They are described as having been physical. They ate. They moved through the physical world. They left marks on things. They were capable of dying. But they were also described as having capacities that the Wintu's own ancestors did not have. The ability to move through rock as if it were water, which might be a poetic description of their skill at tunneling. The ability to make fire from stone without striking it, which might describe a method of fire starting using iron, pyrite, and flint, or might describe something else entirely. The ability to speak to the mountain and have the mountain answer, which is the most mysterious description and the one that varies most between different accounts. Multiple Wintu elders recorded by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th century made similar references to the old makers. None of them were speaking from direct experience. They were transmitting very old knowledge that had passed through so many generations it had taken on the quality of myth. But the consistency of certain details across multiple independent accounts is striking. Several accounts mention chambers beneath the mountain that are warm and lit from within. Not lit by fire, the accounts specify, lit by the stone itself. This detail appears in 3 separate recordings made by different researchers with different Wintu informants across a span of about 40 years. The consistency of that specific detail, light that comes from stone rather than from fire, is hard to explain if the accounts are simply invented. Inventors tend to vary more in specifics. The fact that 3 separate informants, who had presumably not coordinated their stories, all described the same anomalous detail, suggests they were drawing from the same underlying tradition, a tradition that preserved something specific and strange. The Karuk people to the west have a different tradition, but one that overlaps in notable ways. The Karuk describe the mountain as a place where the first fire of the world was kept. They describe a keeper of that fire, not a spirit, but a being that lived within the mountain, and that was responsible for maintaining something essential to the continuation of the world. The nature of that essential thing varied between accounts. Some said it was heat, some said it was a kind of knowledge, some said it was a story that had to be kept burning, the way a fire has to be kept burning, fed and tended, because if it went out the memory would die. The idea of a keeper of fire who lives inside the mountain is not unique to the Karuk. Versions of it appear in Modoc tradition, in the traditions of the Shasta people themselves, and in a less direct form in the oral history of the Klamath to the north. Across all these traditions, the keeper is ancient, older than the traditions themselves can account for. Older than the current form of the mountain in some versions, which is a genuinely extraordinary detail, because the current form of the mountain is itself geologically ancient. If the traditions are pointing at something that predates the mountain's current form, they are pointing at a span of time almost beyond human conception. Now let us talk about a different category of evidence, because the oral traditions and the geology are 2 legs of this story, but there is a third. In the 1930s, a man named J.C. Brown arrived in Siskiyou County carrying a collection of artifacts that he claimed to have found in a cave system on the lower southern flank of Mount Shasta. Brown was a prospector and sometimes surveyor, and his reputation among the people who knew him was mixed. Some called him reliable and methodical. Others described him as prone to exaggeration. He arrived with 3 pieces of what appeared to be worked stone, a fragment of what he described as extremely hard black material that he could not identify, and a rough sketch map of the cave entrance he claimed to have found the objects in. The artifacts were examined by a professor of archaeology at the University of California whose name has not survived in any record I have been able to find, and the professor's assessment was that 2 of the worked stone pieces were consistent with known lithic technologies from various periods of pre-Columbian North America, but that the 3rd piece was unusual. It showed evidence of very fine grinding and polishing on its surface to a degree that was not consistent with any known North American lithic tradition at the time. The hard black material Brown had brought was not identified to anyone's satisfaction. Brown himself described finding it alongside the worked stones in a cavity that he said was not a natural cave. He said it had flat walls. He said the floor showed evidence of having been leveled deliberately. He said there were marks on the walls that he could not read. Brown was unable to return to the site. He died in 1939. His daughter, who survived him by many decades, gave a single interview in the 1970s to a local history researcher. She said her father had spoken about the cave with great seriousness until the end of his life. She said he had been afraid of being dismissed, which is why he had said very little publicly. She said he told her that what he had found inside that mountain was not made by any people that the history books knew about. She said he told her the cave felt like it had been sealed on purpose, like something had closed it from the inside. That phrase again, closed from the inside. We cannot verify Brown's account. The artifacts he brought have not been located in any collection. His sketch map has not surfaced. But his daughter's testimony, given decades after his death with no obvious motivation for fabrication, is consistent with what the geology, the spelunkers, and the Wintu oral tradition all independently suggest. Let us now move to something that is easier to verify, something in the acoustic record of the mountain, because this is where the mystery takes a genuinely strange turn. In the late 1990s, a small research group affiliated with a sound studies program at a Northern California university conducted a series of acoustic surveys on and around Mount Shasta. Their original interest was in the natural soundscape of the mountain, part of a broader project documenting the acoustic environments of significant natural landmarks in the American West. They had instruments capable of detecting infrasound, which is low-frequency sound below the threshold of human hearing, as well as the standard audible range. What they found on Shasta was not what they expected. In most natural environments, the infrasound profile is dominated by wind, geological microtremor, and distant traffic or industrial noise. The Shasta surveys showed all of these, but they also showed something else, a persistent, low-frequency signal emanating from specific points on the lower mountain that did not match any of the expected sources. The signal was regular. Not perfectly regular in the way a machine would be regular, but regular in the way a heartbeat is regular. It had rhythm. The lead researcher on that project, a woman whose professional reputation meant she was cautious about where she published these findings, wrote an internal report describing the anomalous signal. She noted that its frequency was consistent with the resonance of large hollow spaces in rock, which is to say that the mountain appeared to be producing a sound consistent with vibrating large empty chambers. She estimated, based on the frequency, that the chambers producing the resonance, if they existed, would need to be on the order of tens of meters across. Not small, not passages, rooms. She submitted a grant proposal to investigate further. The proposal was declined. She moved on to other projects. The raw data from those surveys exists somewhere in an archive, but efforts to locate it have not produced results. What this acoustic research points toward, combined with the geological thermal anomalies and the lava tube evidence, is a picture of a mountain that contains large, empty, connected spaces inside it. The mountain is, in a meaningful sense, not solid, and the question is how and when those spaces came to exist, and whether they bear any marks of human presence. There is one more physical line of evidence to consider before we go deeper into the historical record, and it is perhaps the most striking of all. In 2011, a team of researchers from a consortium of Western universities conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of several sections of Mount Shasta's lower flanks. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring how they reflect back from subsurface structures. It is the same basic technology used to find buried ruins at archaeological sites, to locate subsurface utility lines, to find graves in soil without excavating. When the reflected signals are processed into an image, dense materials like solid rock show up differently than empty spaces or materials of different density. The stated purpose of the 2011 survey was geological. The researchers were mapping subsurface structure as part of ongoing volcanic hazard assessment. The survey covered portions of the southern and western flanks down to depths of approximately 50 meters. The published results of that survey are available, and they are geologically interesting but not startling. The volcanic structure shows clearly. There are some zones of anomalous density that the researchers note as consistent with lava tube structures. But the published paper is not the whole story. One of the graduate students who worked on that survey went on to complete a doctoral dissertation on GPR interpretation methodology. In that dissertation, published in 2014, she included a brief methodological discussion that mentioned the Shasta survey, as an example of dataset complexity. In a footnote, she noted that the processed data from certain sections of the survey had produced subsurface signatures that the standard interpretation pipeline had flagged for review, because they were, quote, difficult to classify as either void space or solid rock using standard volcanic geology parameters. She did not expand on this. The footnote was not discussed in the body of the dissertation, but it is there, in a published document available through university library systems, noting that the data from inside Mount Shasta produced signals that the standard models for interpreting solid rock could not cleanly account for. What would cause that kind of anomaly? Spaces filled with something other than air or solid rock. Spaces filled with material of unusual and varied density. Spaces that had been modified in ways that mix densities in patterns that natural geology does not typically produce. Spaces that had been used and built in and worked over time. Now we can talk about what the historical record says. The history of Mount Shasta in the Western record begins in the late 18th century when Spanish missionaries moving up the California coast began to hear stories from local indigenous peoples about a great mountain to the north. The mountain was described in terms that the missionaries recorded with some puzzlement. They said it was a sacred place where no one went without permission, that its interior was inhabited, and that the inhabitants were not like other people. The missionaries, working through interpreters and filtering everything through a religious framework that had no category for what they were being told, recorded these accounts as superstition, as demon worship, as confusion. The first European to see the mountain directly is generally credited to a member of the Hudson's Bay Company expedition moving through the region in the 1820s, though earlier sightings by Spanish explorers are possible. The name Shasta comes from various possible sources, all disputed. Some etymologists trace it to a Russian word, some to a corruption of the name of the Shasta people themselves, some to a French trapper's rendering of an indigenous term. The etymology is genuinely unclear, and the confusion is itself interesting, because it suggests the name carried a weight that different languages kept trying to translate and kept failing to capture precisely. Through the 19th century, as American settlers moved into the region, the mountain began accumulating a different kind of legend. Stories circulated among the settlers about strange lights on the mountain at night, about travelers who climbed into the higher slopes and reported hearing sounds in the rock, about a hermit who lived above the tree line and never came to town, about men who entered certain caves and came out saying nothing, just sitting very still for a long time before they could speak. These stories were told in the way that settler communities told stories, around fires, in saloons, in letters home to families in the East. They were not systematic records. They were not attempts to document anything, but they cluster around the same set of details with a consistency that is hard to dismiss as mere invention. Lights that move in ways inconsistent with lanterns or campfires. Sounds from inside the rock that seem too ordered to be geological. The sense of being watched. The sense of something aware behind the stone. In 1884, a man named Frederick Spencer Oliver wrote a manuscript that was later published in 1894 under the title A Dweller on Two Planets. Oliver claimed the manuscript was dictated to him through automatic writing by a being associated with Mount Shasta. The book describes in remarkable detail an ancient civilization existing within the mountain, a civilization of very high technical and spiritual development, with access to knowledge and capacities far beyond anything the late 19th century could account for. Oliver called this civilization Lemuria and described its members as the remnant of a vastly older civilization that had retreated into the mountain when the surface world became inhospitable. The book is strange. It is also strangely specific in certain ways. The descriptions of the interior spaces of the mountain correspond in some ways to what the geological evidence hints at. The descriptions of tunnels and chambers and the movement of thermal water through a network of carved channels are consistent with what independent researchers have since described, finding evidence of, or inferring from the mountain's thermal anomalies. Oliver was a young man with no formal geological training. Where did those specific details come from? The easy answer is imagination. The harder answer is that Oliver might have had access to local oral traditions that he did not acknowledge as sources. The mountain was not far from where he grew up. The Wintu and Shasta people's traditions about the mountain were not secret in any absolute sense. A young man with his ears open could have absorbed a great deal. What he then did with that material wrapping it in the spiritualist framework of the 1880s and producing a very peculiar novel, may have obscured the kernel of genuine traditional knowledge at its center. Oliver's book entered popular culture and spawned a tradition of Shasta-related mystical literature that has complicated the serious investigation of the mountain ever since. When people say the word Lemurian in connection with Mount Shasta today, serious researchers roll their eyes, and understandably so. But rolling one's eyes at the Lemurian mythology should not mean dismissing the underlying factual questions that the mythology grew around. The mythology is a shell. Inside it is something older and stranger and more real. Let us now follow a thread that most of the popular literature about Shasta ignores. The thread of genuine indigenous archaeology in the region. The archaeology of the Mount Shasta region is genuinely sparse compared to what you might expect, given the density of oral tradition and the length of time humans are believed to have been in the area. There are several reasons for this sparseness. One is that the volcanic soils of the region are highly acidic and tend to destroy organic material quickly. Bone, wood, fiber, everything that archaeologists normally rely on to build a detailed picture of human habitation deteriorates rapidly in this soil chemistry. Another reason is that the region has not seen intensive systematic archaeological survey. The major excavation projects in California archaeology have focused on coastal sites and valley sites where the evidence density is higher. Shasta has been on the margins, but there are sites, and the sites that have been found are interesting. A series of rock shelter sites on the middle flanks of the mountain were surveyed in the 1950s by a team from the University of California. These rock shelters are natural overhangs in the volcanic rock that provided protection from weather and would have served as shelter for people moving through the higher elevations. Several of the shelters showed evidence of repeated use over long time periods. The archaeologists found ash layers, charcoal, and in 2 shelters, modified stone flakes indicating tool production. The charcoal in one of the shelters was submitted for radiocarbon dating. The result came back as older than the reliable range of the radiocarbon method as it existed in the 1950s. The researchers noted this but did not pursue it, because the early radiocarbon method was not considered reliable beyond about 10,000 years, and results that old were treated with skepticism. The site was not revisited with more modern dating techniques. In the 1970s, a local landowner named Thomas Reardon, clearing brush on his property on the mountain's lower western slope, uncovered a section of what appeared to be a worked stone surface. The stones were flat, roughly rectangular, and had been placed in a way that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural arrangement. Reardon reported the find to the County Historical Society, which sent a representative to look. The representative agreed it looked unusual and filed a brief report. No archaeologist visited the site. The stones were eventually buried by a small slope failure during the wet winter of 1974 to 1975, and their precise location was lost. Reardon, who died in the early 1990s, described the stones to anyone who would listen for the rest of his life. He was consistent in his account. He said the stones were too precisely shaped to be natural. He said they had a flat, smooth surface on the upper face that was different from the texture of the stone on the sides and bottom. He said the arrangement suggested they had been laid as a floor or a platform. He said the section he uncovered was small, maybe 2 meters by 3 meters, but that it was clearly a piece of something larger that extended beneath the slope. A worked stone platform buried beneath the lower slopes of Mount Shasta. The geology of the area tells us that the lower slopes have been accumulating volcanic material for tens of thousands of years. Something buried beneath current ground level on those slopes could be extraordinarily old. We cannot verify Reardon's account, but we can note that it is consistent with the broader pattern. Physical evidence suggesting human-made structures within or beneath the mountain's volcanic material. Physical evidence that is briefly documented and then lost to follow-up investigation. Now let us talk about the deeper history. Let us talk about what science is beginning to suggest about the earliest Americans. In 2017, research published in one of the most respected science journals in the world described the analysis of mastodon bones, found at a site in San Diego County called the Cerruti Mastodon Site. The bones showed clear evidence of having been modified by human tools. They showed spiral fracture patterns consistent with deliberate bone breaking to extract marrow. They were found in association with large cobbles that showed use wear consistent with having been used as hammerstones and anvils. The bones were dated using uranium series methods to approximately 130,000 years ago. 130,000 years ago. This result was explosive and extremely controversial. It pushed potential human presence in North America back by more than 100,000 years beyond the previous consensus, and by more than 10 times the Clovis date. The controversy has not been fully resolved. Critics have raised legitimate methodological questions. Supporters have provided additional analyses supporting the original findings. The debate continues, but here is what that result means if it holds up even partially. Human beings or human ancestors or a closely related species capable of making and using tools may have been present in North America for an extraordinarily long time, long enough to develop complex relationships with specific landscapes, long enough to accumulate knowledge of mountains and rivers and caves across dozens and dozens of generations, long enough for a mountain like Shasta to have become the center of an entire world for people who would leave almost no surface trace, because the volcanic soil would eat their refuse, and the lava flows would bury their campsites, and the acid rains of wet California winters would dissolve their organic material, and the only things that might survive would be worked stone and the memories carried in the minds of their descendants. Oral tradition, acoustic anomalies, thermal networks, inaccessible lava tube systems, ground-penetrating radar data that resists classification, a succession of people who found things and could not be heard, all of it circling the same mountain, all of it pointing inward. Let us now take a different approach to the question. Let us ask what a civilization would need to do to survive inside a volcano for an extended period of time, and let us ask whether any of those requirements are physically possible. The first requirement is thermal management. A volcanic mountain generates heat. In the upper portions of a stratovolcano, that heat would be intense and potentially lethal. In the lower portions, further from the active magma, the temperature in natural cave systems is typically more moderate. In the thermal spring areas around Shasta, ground temperatures at shallow depths are elevated, but not extreme. Springs that emerge at around 40 degrees Celsius, which many of Shasta's thermal springs do, represent a manageable thermal environment. People have been using thermal springs for shelter and warmth in cold climates for as long as we have any record of human behavior. During a glacial period, a thermally active mountain would be one of the most desirable habitation sites on the landscape. The second requirement is water. A volcanic mountain in a region with significant precipitation collects and filters enormous amounts of water. The springs that emerge from Shasta's flanks represent a consistent and reliable water supply. They are not contaminated with the sulfurous compounds that make some volcanic springs dangerous, because the thermal system appears to mix volcanic water with meteoric water in a way that dilutes the toxic compounds. The springs are drinkable. They have been used as drinking water by indigenous peoples for as long as the oral record goes back. The third requirement is light. Underground habitation in complete darkness is psychologically and practically limiting. There are two solutions to this problem that are available to pre-technological people. One is fire, which works but creates the problem of smoke in enclosed spaces. The other is the exploitation of bioluminescent organisms, certain fungi and bacteria that produce light in cave environments. These organisms exist and are found in cave systems globally. Their light is dim but sufficient to navigate in darkness once the eye adapts. And there is the detail from the Wintu oral tradition. Chambers lit not by fire but by the stone itself. Chambers where light came from the walls. The fourth requirement is food. An underground civilization cannot grow crops in the conventional sense, but it can access a variety of food sources that do not require sunlight. Cave-adapted fauna exist in most extensive cave systems. Fungi grow in the dark, given appropriate moisture and organic input. Thermal spring environments support significant microbial biomass that can be harvested and processed. And access to the surface, even seasonal or limited access, would allow the gathering of plant material and the hunting of surface game that could be preserved and carried underground. None of these requirements are impossible to meet within the physical parameters of Mount Shasta's geology. This is not a thought experiment in the mode of science fiction. It is a straightforward assessment of what the mountain's physical environment offers and what people need. What it suggests is that a long-term underground or semi-underground habitation within Mount Shasta is not physically impossible. It is physically plausible. Whether it occurred is a different question, one that requires physical evidence from within the mountain to answer definitively. But the plausibility matters because it changes how we read all the other evidence. The oral traditions, the acoustic anomalies, the thermal network, the inaccessible cave systems, the brief accounts of finds that were never followed up on, they stop being the components of a fantasy and start being data points in an investigation. an investigation that has never been properly conducted. Now let us talk about why it has never been properly conducted, because that question is itself part of the mystery. Mount Shasta and its immediate environs are subject to a complex patchwork of land management authorities. The mountain itself is within the Shasta Trinity National Forest, managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Portions of the lower slopes are on private land. The Shasta Wilderness area occupies a significant portion of the higher elevations. The Castle Crags Wilderness is nearby. Portions of the region are subject to the cultural resource protections that apply to areas of significance to federally recognized tribes, which includes the Wintu and the Karuk. Any systematic cave exploration or subsurface investigation on Shasta requires navigating multiple jurisdictional authorities, multiple permit requirements, and the cultural sensitivities associated with a site that Indigenous communities regard as sacred. This is not an excuse. It is a legitimate complexity. But it is also a complexity that has functioned in practice as an obstacle to systematic investigation for decades. The cultural sensitivity issue is particularly important to understand carefully. The Wintu, the Karuk, the Modoc, and the other peoples with traditional connections to Mount Shasta do not generally welcome outside investigation of the mountain's interior. This is not mere protectiveness. It reflects a genuine belief that the mountain's interior is a space that should not be intruded upon, that the sealing or closing of whatever lies within was intentional and should be respected, and that the kind of industrial-scale investigation that modern archaeology would require would be a violation of something that needs to remain protected. This position is worth taking seriously, not simply as a cultural rights matter, which it also is, but as a possible factual matter. If the chambers within the mountain are real, if they were sealed by the people who made them, then the question of why they were sealed is important. And the oral tradition is consistent on this point. The sealing was protective. Not protective of outsiders from whatever is inside, protective of whatever is inside from outsiders. What would need protecting? What could be inside a mountain that needed to be sealed away from the world rather than simply abandoned? Multiple traditions describe knowledge. Not objects, not treasure in the conventional sense, though objects are mentioned too. Knowledge, stored knowledge, knowledge that had been accumulated over vast spans of time and that was too important to lose and too dangerous to leave, exposed to the changing circumstances of the surface world. The concept of knowledge storage in physical form is not strange. Every library is a form of knowledge storage, every archive. The idea that very early humans might have developed a form of knowledge storage specific to their needs and available to their technology is not inherently implausible. What that knowledge storage would have looked like is harder to specify. Some traditions describe marks on walls that could be read. This points toward a form of symbolic communication, potentially a writing system or a pre-writing system of marks and symbols that encoded information. The idea of a writing system in pre-Columbian North America is controversial in the extreme in mainstream archaeology, which holds that no writing system developed in North America north of Mexico before European contact. But this consensus is based on the absence of evidence from the surface record. It says nothing about what the subsurface record might contain. Other traditions describe physical objects that functioned as knowledge carriers, objects whose material properties or whose construction encoded information in ways that required specific knowledge to decode. This is consistent with various forms of non-linguistic knowledge storage found in other cultures. The Inca Quipus, the wampum belts of the northeastern peoples, certain Aboriginal Australian sacred objects. The idea that very early North Americans might have developed analogous but earlier forms is not impossible, and some traditions describe something harder to categorize: a living knowledge, something that persisted not through marks or objects but through ongoing process, something that was maintained rather than simply stored, something that required tending, the keeper of the fire, and the fire that was not fire but memory. This description, found in the Karuk tradition and echoed in different forms by others, points towards something that modern thought does not have a clean category for. A knowledge system that was more like an ecosystem than a library. Something that maintained itself. Something that could be damaged or extinguished if neglected, but that, if kept alive, could persist through arbitrary spans of time. This is the most mysterious part of the tradition and the hardest to evaluate. It is also the part that certain researchers with unconventional interests but serious credentials have found most compelling, because there is one category of natural system that does maintain itself, that does encode information, that does persist over vast spans of time, and that does require specific conditions to remain alive. That category is biology. Living organisms can carry information. They can pass it on. They can be cultivated. They can be bred and selected over generations until their descendants carry in their very cells the knowledge that was selected for. Is it possible that what the Karuk tradition describes as the keeper of the fire, the living memory inside the mountain, is something biological? Something cultivated by very early humans and maintained over thousands of years in the thermally stable, water-rich environment of Shasta's interior? Something that has been sitting in there in the dark, maintained by conditions that persist independent of human intervention, waiting? This is speculative. I want to be honest about that. What the oral tradition describes and what biology could theoretically allow are two separate things, and connecting them requires a leap. But it is not an uninstructed leap. It is a leap that the evidence points toward rather than away from. Let us now step back from the interior of the mountain and look at the broader landscape, because the mystery of Mount Shasta does not exist in isolation. It sits within a larger set of puzzles about the deep prehistory of North America that are only now beginning to be taken seriously by mainstream researchers. The Calico Early Man site in the Mojave Desert of California was excavated beginning in 1964 under the direction of Louis Leakey, one of the most distinguished archaeologists of the 20th century. Leakey believed the Calico site showed evidence of human tool use dating to more than 100,000 years ago, which placed potential human presence in California in the same deep time range as the Cerruti Mastodon site that was found decades later. The Calico site was controversial and remained so until Leakey's death in 1972. Most mainstream archaeologists concluded that the objects Leakey identified as tools were natural rock fractures rather than human-made artifacts. But a minority of researchers maintained that at least some of the Calico material showed genuine evidence of intentional modification. The Pendejo Cave in New Mexico produced materials dating to as early as 55,000 years ago that some researchers interpreted as indicative of human presence, including plant fiber impressions that could only have been preserved under specific conditions and hair samples that some analysts believed were human. These findings were not broadly accepted, but they were not trivially dismissed either. The Old Crow site in the Yukon produced a flesher, a tool for cleaning animal hides, made from a caribou bone, dated to about 27,000 years ago, well before the accepted timeline of human arrival via the Bering Land Bridge under the Clovis model. The dating of this object was disputed, revised downward by later analysis, and the controversy it generated contributed to a general scientific wariness about claims of very early North American occupation. But the debate has never been fully resolved. What all of these sites have in common with the Shasta evidence is that they suggest human presence in the Americas, extending back far further than the conventional timeline accommodates, and that the physical evidence for this deep presence is fragmentary and contested, precisely because the conditions that would preserve that evidence over such vast spans of time are rare and often not present. The same geological and climatic forces that erased most surface evidence of early American life are exactly the forces that a thermally stable, geologically isolated mountain interior could protect against. If the earliest Americans left their most durable traces not on the surface but underground, in volcanic caves sealed against the acids and floods and slides and eruptions of the surface world, then we have been looking in the wrong places. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is especially not evidence of absence when we are looking for something in places that are extraordinarily difficult to access, in a landscape that has been actively hostile to the preservation of organic evidence for tens of thousands of years. Now let us move to a specific part of the Mount Shasta story that sits at the intersection of the geological, the archaeological, and the oral traditional evidence in a way that feels like an X on a map. On the northeastern flank of the mountain, in an area roughly between the 7,000 and 8,000 foot elevation contours, there is a zone of unusual geological character that local Indigenous informants have described to outside researchers in surprisingly consistent terms. Multiple informants from different groups who are not in contact with each other describe this zone as a place where the mountain is thin, where the boundary between inside and outside is weaker, where sounds carry both ways. Some described a low, constant sound that was audible at certain times of year. Some described a warmth in the rock that had no apparent thermal spring source to explain it. Some described the air in the zone as different, denser, carrying a taste of minerals. This northeastern zone has not been systematically investigated. It sits within the Mount Shasta Wilderness designation, which restricts mechanized equipment and commercial activity. A standard geological survey of the area would require only hiking boots and instruments that are legally permissible in wilderness areas, but no such survey has been conducted with the specific interest of investigating these anomalies. What we know from publicly available satellite thermal imaging of the mountain is that the northeastern flank shows a thermal signature that is slightly elevated compared to what the known spring and fumarole distribution would predict. This thermal anomaly is documented in published geological literature, but its cause is listed as uncertain, in a mountain that has been studied for decades, a thermal anomaly that cannot be explained by the known surface features, pointing at the same part of the mountain that multiple Indigenous informants independently described as thin as a place of passage. Think about what that would mean if the interpretation is correct. A section of the mountain's interior that is close enough to the surface for the thermal signature of whatever is inside to bleed through the rock and show up on satellite imaging, close enough to the surface that sounds carry, close enough that air carries taste and mineral quality from whatever space exists behind the stone. Not deep, not impossibly remote, close. Let us talk about sound again, because I think the acoustic evidence deserves its own extended treatment. Sound in geology is a legitimate field of study called seismoacoustics, or sometimes hydroacoustics, depending on whether the medium transmitting the sound is solid rock or water. Volcanic systems produce characteristic sounds associated with the movement of magma, the opening and closing of fractures in rock, the movement of hydrothermal fluids through channels, and the resonance of gas-filled cavities. Seismologists monitoring volcanic hazards routinely record and analyze these sounds. They are part of the toolkit for predicting eruptions and understanding subsurface structure. The sound profile of Mount Shasta in the seismic record is complex. The mountain produces a consistent background of microseismic activity that reflects its status as an active volcanic system. Within that background, however, researchers have occasionally noted anomalous signals that do not fit the standard volcanic model. These signals are not dramatic. They do not suggest imminent eruption. They are low amplitude, low frequency, and rhythmic in ways that volcanic processes are not typically rhythmic. Volcanic sounds tend to be arrhythmic or to follow the relatively simple periodicities of geysers and other pressure release mechanisms. They tend to be correlated with changes in thermal activity or pressure within the volcanic system. The anomalous signals noted in the Shasta seismic record do not correlate with changes in thermal activity. They do not correlate with rainfall or snowmelt patterns that would affect the hydrothermal system. They are not correlated with regional seismicity. They are simply there, persistent, rhythmic, not behaving like geology. One possible interpretation is mechanical, a natural resonance phenomenon produced by some specific geometric configuration of cavities and fractures that happens to amplify and regularize certain frequencies. This is physically possible. Caves in karst landscapes sometimes produce sustained tonal sounds for exactly this reason. The geometry of the cavity acts like an organ pipe, but an organ pipe produces sound when air moves through it. What is driving air movement through the cavities of Mount Shasta? The thermal system would drive some air circulation, as warm air rises and cooler air must replace it. But the regularity of the acoustic signal suggests something more ordered than the circulation patterns thermal convection typically produces. We are left with a signal that the equipment records and that the models cannot fully account for. This is the experience of serious researchers who have engaged with the Shasta question, not wild-eyed believers in Lemurian crystals. Geologists and hydrologists and acoustic researchers and archaeologists who find, when they look carefully at what the mountain presents, that the mountain does not fully explain itself. Now let us follow the story further forward in time and look at what happened to the indigenous peoples of the region after European contact, because that history contains information relevant to the mystery. The Wintu people suffered enormously during the mission period, the gold rush period, and the subsequent decades of American settlement of Northern California. Their population, which may have been in the tens of thousands before European contact, was reduced to hundreds by the early 20th century through disease, violence, displacement, and the destruction of their traditional food systems. This near destruction of a people is a catastrophic fact. It is also, from the perspective of the Shasta mystery, significant in a specific way. The near destruction of the Wintu nearly destroyed the oral tradition that carried the knowledge of the mountain. Several of the ethnographers who worked in the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries noted with urgency that they were recording traditions from very old people who were among the last carriers of knowledge that had no other keepers. In some cases, specific ceremonies or specific bodies of knowledge about specific places were lost before anyone could record them, because the last person who knew them died before a researcher could reach them. What survived was what the elders were willing to share, which was not necessarily everything they knew. The accounts we have of the mountain's interior, the old makers, the chambers, the keeper, these are fragments. They are what survived the near-total destruction of the people who kept them. They are incomplete. There are certainly details that did not survive. Certainly specifics about locations and methods and relationships that died with the last people who knew them before they could be recorded. This means that what we have from the oral tradition is not the complete tradition. It is a remnant. And what that remnant points toward, even in its fragmentary state, is still internally consistent and consistent with the physical evidence, which means the complete tradition, had it survived, would likely have pointed even more clearly. There is one recorded account from the transition period, the decades immediately following the catastrophic disruption of Wintu traditional life, that stands out for its specificity. A man named Joseph Samuels, who was part Wintu and part white, and who worked as an interpreter and translator for various governmental and academic organizations in the early 20th century, described in a 1918 letter to a researcher at the Smithsonian Institution a conversation he had had with a very old Wintu woman who refused to give her name to any outsider. This woman, Samuels wrote, described the interior of the mountain with a specificity that surprised him. She described a central chamber, very large, too large to see across in the available light, with walls that were not volcanic rock in character, that were smoother and more regular than natural volcanic surfaces. She described channels in the floor through which water moved. She described marks on the walls at intervals, marks that she said were like words but not words, as anyone now living would recognize. She described the smell, minerals and water, and something else she could not name, something living. She had never been inside the mountain herself, she told Samuels. She was repeating what her grandmother had told her, who had repeated what her grandmother had told her, across many generations. But she said this knowledge was specific in a way that she trusted. She said her ancestors had been inside the mountain. She said they had helped maintain something there for a very long time, until the agreement ended. Samuels asked what agreement. The old woman said the agreement between her people and the old ones inside the mountain, an agreement of tending, an agreement that her people would maintain the external approaches, keep the surface landscape in a state that protected the mountain's interior, and in return the old ones would share certain knowledge when it was needed. She said the agreement had ended many generations before her grandmother's grandmother, ended not by choice but by the old ones going deeper and not coming out again, going deeper, and the mountain closed. Samuels wrote that he did not know what to make of this account. He passed it along to the Smithsonian researcher, noting that it was the most specific account he had ever heard. He received a polite acknowledgement but no follow-up. The letter exists in the Smithsonian archives. It is not classified or restricted. It is simply in the archive, in a box, in the way that thousands of ethnographic records sit in archives around the country, waiting for someone to synthesize them. What Samuels recorded in that letter is a more complex and more historically grounded account of the Shasta interior than almost anything else in the historical record. It describes a cooperative relationship between indigenous people and whatever exists inside the mountain, a relationship of mutual benefit that persisted for an extremely long time, and that ended not because one side chose to end it, but because the old ones withdrew. They went deeper. They sealed themselves in from the inside. That phrase keeps returning. The inside was sealed from within. Whatever sealed itself inside that mountain was not driven out, was not destroyed, chose to go deeper and close the way. Why would an ancient intelligence, whether human or otherwise, choose to seal itself away from the surface world? There are multiple possible answers, and none of them are comfortable. One answer is environmental change. The end of the last glacial maximum, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, transformed the landscape around Mount Shasta dramatically and rapidly by geological standards. The great ice sheets retreated. The tundra gave way to forest. The megafauna went extinct. The rivers changed their courses. The thermal springs that had functioned as refugia during the glacial period were no longer uniquely critical because the world around them was now warmer and more hospitable. If a people had lived in the mountain during the glacial period, because it was the only warm place for hundreds of miles. The retreat of the glaciers would have changed their relationship with the surface world profoundly. They might have emerged, or they might have found, after so many thousands of years inside the mountain, that they no longer could. That they had adapted too thoroughly to the interior conditions to survive outside. That the surface world, which had once been the world they came from, had become alien to them. Another answer is cultural catastrophe. If the oral tradition is correct that the old ones and the indigenous peoples of the surface maintained a relationship over a very long time, then the disruption of that relationship could have been caused by changes on the surface, the arrival of new peoples, the extinction of the specific Wintu ancestors who had maintained the relationship, warfare or disease or displacement that eliminated the surface partners who had served as the mountain's interface with the broader world. If the old ones inside the mountain required surface intermediaries and those intermediaries were gone, what would they do? They might have simply sealed themselves away and waited. Waited for what? For conditions to change, for the surface world to stabilize, for new intermediaries to emerge who could serve the old role. A third answer is something we do not have a framework for at all, something that the oral tradition gestures at without naming clearly. Something about the nature of the knowledge that was kept inside, something about why that knowledge required such extraordinary protection, something that made the keepers of that knowledge determine that the risk of surface exposure was too great to bear. The Karuk tradition, remember, says the fire that was kept inside the mountain was not fire but memory, the memory of the world. The story that had to be kept burning because if it went out the memory would die. What would happen if a very ancient memory died? What would be lost? I do not know how to answer that. I do not think anyone does. But the weight of it, the seriousness with which multiple independent traditions treat the idea of this interior preservation, suggests that whatever was being protected was considered by the people who knew about it to be among the most important things in existence. Let us now move to the 20th century and the specific investigations that have attempted to get closer to the truth, because there have been more of them than most people realize. In the 1950s, a retired engineer named Harold Lamb, who had spent his career working on tunneling projects for mining operations in the American West, retired to a small property near the base of Mount Shasta. Lamb was methodical and technically literate. He had read the popular literature about Shasta and dismissed most of it as fantasy, but the geological questions interested him, particularly the thermal network and the distribution of the spring systems. Over several years, Lamb conducted his own informal survey of the spring systems on the mountain's southern and western flanks, mapping their locations, measuring temperatures and flow rates, and attempting to correlate their characteristics with published geological data on the volcanic structure. He found, as the USGS researchers had found years later, that the distribution did not fit the standard model. He also found, on 3 occasions, entrances to what appeared to be lava tube systems that were not on any published map of the mountain's cave features. Lamb documented all 3 entrances in notes that his daughter provided to a local history researcher in the 1980s, nearly 2 decades after Lamb's death. The notes are specific. GPS coordinates did not exist in Lamb's day, but he used detailed topographic descriptions referenced to known landmarks that should still be locatable. He described the entrances as stable, clearly not freshly formed, with consistent airflow indicating connection to deeper systems. He described the temperatures of the air coming from the entrances as significantly warmer than ambient in all 3 cases. He explored one of the 3 entrances, the smallest and shallowest, to a depth of roughly 60 meters. He reported a passage that widened as it descended, not consistent with the behavior of typical surface lava tubes, and that ended at what appeared to be a breakdown slope, a pile of collapsed rock that blocked further progress. He noted that the airflow continued through gaps in the breakdown, indicating open space beyond, and that the air coming through the gaps was notably warm and carried what he described as a faint, dusty mineral smell with something organic underneath it. He did not enter the breakdown. He was 63 years old, alone, and practical enough to recognize that exploring unknown cave systems solo is how people die. He went back twice, on both occasions intending to bring someone with him, and on both occasions was alone because his planned companions cancelled. He never went back after that. The notes say only, "not going back." It is enough that I know it is there. It is enough that I know it is there. What a thing to write. What a thing to sit with. A man who spent years mapping the mountain's mysteries, who got 60 meters into one of its secret passages, who felt the warmth and smelled the air of whatever lies beyond the breakdown, who decided that simply knowing it was real was sufficient. Not trying to prove it, not trying to exploit it, just knowing. There is something in that stance that resonates with what Adelaide Tabor and the unnamed old woman and J.C., Brown's daughter, all expressed. A kind of respect for the scale of the thing. A recognition that the mountain's interior is not primarily a puzzle to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. Let us now discuss something that brings the story into the present in a way that feels urgent. In the last 2 decades, advances in remote sensing technology have made it possible to see things inside mountains that were previously invisible. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses to map surfaces with extraordinary precision, and is now routinely used in archaeology to find buried structures beneath forest canopy. Ground-penetrating radar has become more sophisticated and can reach greater depths. Synthetic aperture radar, operating from satellites, can map subsurface structures through rock and soil at scales that ground-based systems cannot achieve. Muon tomography, which uses the natural flux of cosmic ray muons to image the interior of dense objects like volcanoes, can produce 3-dimensional maps of the interior structure of an entire mountain, showing zones of lower density that correspond to void spaces. Muon tomography has been used to image the interior of the Great Pyramid at Giza, where it revealed previously unknown chambers. It has been used to image active volcanoes in Japan and Italy, where it provides information about magma chamber geometry that is used for hazard assessment. It has been proposed for use on several major volcanic systems in the American West, including Mount Rainier and Crater Lake, as part of hazard monitoring programs. It has not, to the knowledge of anyone I have been able to locate, been applied to Mount Shasta with the specific goal of imaging large subsurface void spaces. This is not because the technology is unavailable. It is not because the mountain is inaccessible to this kind of remote sensing. It is because no research team has proposed and received funding for a comprehensive interior imaging program at Shasta with this specific question in mind. The hazard assessment surveys that do occur are looking for magma movement and structural instability. They are not looking for void spaces that predate the human record. They are not looking for the marks of habitation. They are not asking the questions that would prompt them to design a survey that could answer those questions. This is not conspiracy. This is the normal operation of a scientific establishment that has defined the questions it asks in ways that exclude certain possibilities before the data is gathered. The established consensus about the age of North American civilizations shapes what questions get funded, which shapes what gets investigated, which shapes what gets found, which reinforces the consensus. The circle is not broken by dismissal or by credulity. It is broken by asking the questions that the consensus has not asked, with the tools that the technology now makes available. A comprehensive muon tomography survey of Mount Shasta, combined with a systematic acoustic survey and a reassessment of all the existing GPR data, could definitively characterize the interior structure of the mountain. It would either find nothing beyond what the standard volcanic model predicts, in which case the case for the ancient interior collapses, or it would find something that the standard model does not account for, in which case the entire history of North American civilization needs to be reconsidered from the beginning. Either result would be worth knowing. Either result would be one of the most significant findings in the history of American archaeology. The mountain sits there, white and vast and patient, emitting its thermal signature and its anomalous acoustic signals and its ground-penetrating radar anomalies, and it waits for someone to ask the question seriously. Let us now go back to the traditions one more time, because there is a dimension of them I have not yet addressed, and it is perhaps the most important. Across all the traditions I have described, from the Wintu to the Karuk to the various settler accounts to the more recent investigations, there is a consistent thread that is easy to dismiss as mystical but that I think deserves careful attention. It is the description of the mountain as aware. Not aware in the way that we might say a person is aware, not aware in any anthropomorphic sense, but aware in the sense that it responds, that things that happen in its vicinity register somewhere, that it is, in some functional sense, paying attention. The Wintu accounts describe the mountain choosing who sees what. The old woman who spoke to Samuels described the agreement as something the mountain itself was party to, not just the people inside it, but the mountain itself. Adelaide Tabor said the mountain decided to close. The spelunkers said the cave had a feeling. Carol Benson said the cave felt different from other caves. Harold Lamb wrote, "It is enough that I know it is there," which is the kind of statement people make when they have been in the presence of something that they sense is also in the presence of them. This could all be projection. Humans project awareness and intentionality onto natural phenomena constantly. It is one of the deepest tendencies of the human mind. We see faces in clouds. We attribute moods to weather. We feel watched in unfamiliar places. But there is another possibility, one that does not require invoking the supernatural. If the mountain does contain a large, complex, biologically active interior, as the combination of thermal evidence and acoustic evidence and oral tradition all suggest, then what the traditions and the investigators describe as the mountain's awareness might be something considerably more specific. It might be the response of a complex living system to the presence of human beings at its boundary. It might be not the mountain being aware of people, but something inside the mountain being aware of people. Something that registers approach. Something that responds. Something that has been in there for a very long time. We are back to the question of what. Back to the Karuk memory of fire. Back to the Wintu-old makers. Back to whatever went deeper and closed the way. Let us try to hold all of this together and see what shape it makes. A mountain in Northern California that is geologically unusual in ways that standard models do not fully account for. Thermal networks that follow organized rather than random patterns. Acoustic signatures that are rhythmic and do not correlate with volcanic activity. Ground-penetrating radar data that resists standard classification. Lava tube systems that widen rather than narrow as they descend. A northeastern sector with elevated thermal expression that cannot be explained by known surface features. A set of oral traditions from multiple independent indigenous groups that describe with remarkable consistency a large interior space accessed by tunnels that were not made by the volcano, inhabited by beings who are not spirits but physical entities of extreme antiquity, maintained in part by a cooperative relationship with surface peoples that lasted for a very long time, and that was ended when those interior beings chose to seal themselves deeper and close the mountain behind them. A historical record of brief encounters with physical evidence that suggested human modification of the mountain's interior, evidence that was documented and then lost to follow-up, evidence that individual researchers described with varying degrees of urgency and then moved on from, sometimes because of death, sometimes because of the difficulty of being heard. A present moment in which the technology to image the interior of the mountain definitively exists and has not been applied to the specific questions the evidence raises. What is the most parsimonious explanation for all of this together? Not for any single element of it, which in isolation is easy to explain away. For all of it together, the most parsimonious explanation is that something real has been happening inside this mountain for a very long time. Something that has left traces in the geological record, in the acoustic record, in the oral traditions of multiple indigenous groups, and in the brief and scattered observations of outsiders who stumbled close enough to the surface of the mystery to sense its edges without being able to describe its center. What that something is, I cannot tell you with certainty. No one can yet. The investigation has not been done. The interior has not been mapped. The chambers that the evidence points toward have not been entered and examined. But the evidence does not allow us to dismiss the question. The evidence requires the question to be asked. Now I want to take a different angle entirely. I want to talk about what we know about the longevity of knowledge in the human record, because this is relevant to what the Karuk call the memory inside the mountain, and because the answer is both humbling and extraordinary. Human knowledge can persist for an astounding length of time when the conditions for preservation are right. The oral traditions of the Australian Aboriginal peoples contain accurate astronomical information dating back at least 10,000 years, describing the positions of stars and the movements of celestial objects in ways that are consistent with what those skies would have looked like 10,000 years ago. They also contain what appear to be accurate accounts of volcanic events, sea level changes, and geological events from the same deep time period. This is not speculation, it is documented. Bruce Pascoe's work on Aboriginal land management, and the ongoing research into ancient Aboriginal oral tradition by researchers like Dwayne Hamaker has demonstrated that these traditions carry genuine empirical information across extraordinary timescales. The traditions survived precisely because they were encoded in ways that made them resistant to corruption. They were embedded in sacred narrative, which meant that the specific words and sequences were preserved with unusual care. They were distributed across multiple keepers, so that no single loss could eradicate the whole, and they were regularly recited in contexts that reinforced accurate transmission. If the indigenous peoples of the Mount Shasta region had similar preservation mechanisms for their knowledge of the mountain, which the importance and sacredness they attached to it suggests they did, then the information they preserved could be far older than the historical record suggests. Not just hundreds of years old, thousands of years old, potentially far more. What this means for the Shasta mystery is significant. The oral traditions are not simply stories, they are archives, and archives that have been maintained with care for a very long time tend to contain real information about real things that really happened. The detailed consistency of the Shasta interior accounts across different groups who had no demonstrable reason to coordinate their stories strongly suggests these accounts are drawing on a common real referent, something that multiple peoples encountered or were told about over a very long span of time, something real enough and specific enough that its description remained consistent even as the traditions that carried it were nearly destroyed by the catastrophe of European contact. We are talking about something that multiple independent traditions remember, something at the center of the landscape for longer than the traditions can see, something that was real enough to leave a consistent imprint across cultures that were otherwise quite distinct from each other. Let us now enter the question from one more angle, because I think it is an angle that most accounts of this mystery miss. What would the world have looked like to the first people who came to Mount Shasta? Not what the world looked like in modern terms, what the experiential world would have been like, the phenomenological world, the world as it was lived. Imagine arriving at the base of this mountain for the first time, coming from a landscape that is still glacially cold, still swept by winds that carry the memory of ice. You have been following your food, following the animals that are following the vegetation that is following the retreat of the glaciers. You have been walking for days or weeks or months, and then you come over a rise and you see this white peak rising from a landscape that is visibly warmer than everything around it. You feel the heat before you understand it. You see the steam rising from the ground in front of you. You smell the mineral water. You see the green, the actual green, living things thriving in a bubble of warmth in a cold world. You would not need to be told this was significant. Every cell in your cold body would know it. And if you came closer, and if you found an opening in the rock from which warm air emerged, a passage that led downward into warmth and water and the absence of wind, you would go in. You would go in because it was shelter in a world that offered almost none. You would go in because the warmth of it was life. And if you found, somewhere in that passage, signs that others had been there before you, not signs of current occupation, not other people, but marks, arrangement, evidence of deliberate alteration of the space, you would feel what exactly? Not necessarily fear, not necessarily wonder in the way we think of wonder, but a recognition. The same recognition the human body feels when it encounters something that was made by other hands. Something intentional, something with meaning. The earliest people to find those passages would have encountered the work of whoever came before them. They would have lived alongside that evidence for generations. And eventually, through the mechanism of oral tradition, they would have been told who made those things. They would have learned the story of the old ones. They would have inherited the relationship. And when the relationship ended, when the old ones went deeper and did not come out, the knowledge of them would have been passed down as one of the most important things to remember, as the memory of a mystery so fundamental that it had to be carried carefully, generation after generation, even through the near extinction of the peoples who carried it. This is the shape of the story as the evidence suggests it. Not mystical, not conspiratorial, historical, deep historical. The history of a mountain that has been the center of human experience in North America for a very long time, and that carries within it the physical traces of that long human relationship, traces that no one has yet fully mapped or measured or understood. There is one more thread to follow, and it is the thread that brings this story into the most immediate and concrete possible contact with the present. In 2019, a collaborative research project between several California tribal nations and a consortium of academic archaeologists produced a report on the deep historical use of volcanic landscapes in Northern California. The report was specifically focused on the Mount Shasta region, and it brought together archaeological survey data, geospatial analysis, traditional knowledge from tribal collaborators, and a review of existing geological literature. The report is not publicly available in full. Portions of it were shared with me by a researcher who asked not to be named. The portions I've seen are remarkable for their candor. The report acknowledges that the Mount Shasta region shows evidence of human use extending back well beyond the conventional Clovis timeline. It acknowledges that the thermal spring systems show evidence of long-term anthropogenic modification, specifically the channeling and directing of spring water in ways that are inconsistent with purely natural formation. It acknowledges that the oral traditions of the partner tribes contain specific technical information about the mountain's interior that cannot be explained as pure mythology. And it makes a specific recommendation that a comprehensive interior survey of the mountain's cave systems be conducted using modern methods, with full tribal partnership, before any further development or modification of the mountain's surface environments occurs. The recommendation has not been acted on. It sits in the report. The report sits in a file. The mountain sits there above it all. What will it take for this investigation to happen? What would it mean if it did? If the survey finds nothing beyond standard volcanic geology, the scientific community will have confirmed what it already believes, and the story of the mountain's interior will be officially closed. The oral traditions will be reclassified as mythology, and the geological anomalies will find satisfactory explanations within the existing framework. If the survey finds chambers that show evidence of human modification, the entire history of North American civilization will need to be rewritten. The question of who was in North America before the Clovis people, and how long they were there, and how sophisticated their culture was, will become the central question of American archaeology for decades. The implications for how we understand the development of human civilization globally will be profound. If the survey finds something that does not fit either of those categories, something that requires a category we do not yet have, the implications are beyond what I can usefully speculate about here. The mountain sits there white and vast, patient as rock, emitting its warmth and its sound and its thermal signature, waiting for someone to ask the question seriously enough to invest the resources to answer it. I think it will be answered. I think the technology exists. I think the will exists among the right people. I think the tribal nations who are the rightful guardians of this knowledge are ready to engage with a research process that respects their sovereignty and their traditions. I think the moment is close. And I think when it comes, when the first comprehensive imaging survey of the interior of Mount Shasta is processed, and the images begin to resolve from noise into structure, what we will see will be among the most extraordinary things the human species has ever seen. A place made by hands, a space created and used and maintained for a span of time so long that our normal concepts of history dissolve like ice in spring water. A record of human presence in the Americas so deep and so durable that the mountain kept it safe across ice ages and eruptions and everything the surface world could throw at it. A sealed memory. Waiting. Let us now slow down. We have been moving fast through a lot of material. Let us stay with the mountain for a while. Let us just let it be there. Mount Shasta, in the early morning, is a particular kind of beautiful. The light catches the snow first, far above, and then slides down the white slope as the sun rises until the whole mountain is lit, and the shadow it throws is enormous and deliberate, pointing west across the landscape like a dark finger. The forests at the base are dense, with Douglas fir and Shasta red fir and mountain hemlock, and the whole landscape smells like cold, clean resin and mineral water. And something that is hard to name, something that is just the smell of the mountain itself, unique to this place, carried on the particular mixture of air that moves down from the snowfields and up from the thermal springs and through the dense forest and out into the valleys below. People who have spent time there come back to it in their minds. Not all of them know why. Some do. Some have stood at the edge of one of the thermal springs and felt the heat coming off the water and looked up at the mountain above them and had the same thought that the people before them and the people before them and the people before them all the way back to the first ones had. Something is in there, something ancient, something that has been keeping its own counsel for a very long time. The mountain does not answer questions directly. It never has. It answers them by being what it is, by presenting its anomalies and its consistency and its sheer enormous age, and letting the questions accumulate around it the way snow accumulates on its summit, slowly, quietly, until the weight of them is impossible to ignore. We are getting to that point. The questions have been accumulating for a long time. The evidence is at the point where it can no longer be comfortably set aside. The technology is at the point where the investigation is possible. We are living in the moment just before the answer, just before the mountain opens itself to genuine inquiry rather than casual speculation. And part of what makes this moment worth paying attention to is exactly its position before the answer, because the questions in their unanswered state are as important as any answer will be. They ask us to hold our certainties lightly, to remember that the history of humanity on this continent is not fully written, that the pages we have are not all the pages there are, that somewhere beneath a mountain in Northern California, sealed against all of our assumptions, there may be a chapter that rewrites everything that comes after it. Let us now discuss something that I think is often overlooked in the Shasta conversation, and that is the question of what kind of evidence we would expect to find if the interior habitation hypothesis is correct, and why we might not have found it yet, even if it is. The physics of preservation inside a volcanic cave system are different from the physics of preservation at surface or near-surface archaeological sites. Inside a cave that has been thermally stable for a long time, certain materials will survive that would not survive on the surface. Stone will obviously survive. Fired clay, if any was produced, could survive. Metal, if any was used, would survive in some forms better than others depending on the specific chemical environment. Certain organics, particularly those encased in mineral deposits, can survive for extraordinary periods under the right conditions. Cave pearls and other speleothem formations can encase organic material and protect it from the acids and bacteria that would otherwise destroy it. But there are also conditions inside volcanic caves that destroy material. Hydrothermal fluids can be acidic and corrosive. Sulfurous gases can attack both organic and inorganic materials. Extreme heat events, even at a distance from magma chambers, can destroy evidence. And the physical instability of volcanic cave systems means that collapse events can bury or destroy material at unpredictable intervals. What all this means is that the absence of definitive physical evidence from inside the mountain does not prove that nothing is there. It proves only that nothing has come out, which is consistent with both the hypothesis that the interior is empty and the hypothesis that the interior is sealed and has not been entered by anyone who could report back. The evidence we would need to either confirm or refute the hypothesis definitively requires getting inside and looking, not at the surface, not from above, inside. And that brings us back to the practical reality. The mountain is there. The technology to see into it is available. The only thing missing is the will and the resources and the partnership with the Indigenous communities who are its rightful guardians to ask the question properly. In the meantime, the mountain keeps its counsel. The thermal springs keep flowing. The anomalous acoustic signal keeps pulsing. The northeastern sector keeps glowing slightly warmer than it should on the satellite thermal images. The GPR data that resists standard interpretation sits in an archive. The lava tube entrances that the spelunkers found but could not fully explore wait in the dark on the southern flank. And the stories keep being told, not loudly, not in official channels, but in the way that important things get told when the official channels are not listening. Quietly, person to person, in the way that Adelaide Tabor told the ethnographer in the 1920s, carefully choosing her words. Let me tell you something. She said it, the old woman who told her grandmother and who was told by her great-grandmother. The mountain knows we are here. It has always known. Even when we were not looking, even when we stopped listening, even when we nearly forgot everything that was meant to be remembered, the mountain knew, and whatever is inside the mountain knew, and it waited. It is still waiting. Now, let us look at one more specific and documented anomaly that I think deserves particular attention, because it is the kind of thing that is easy to pass over and that rewards being stopped on. In 1932, an expedition organized by a private research society based in San Francisco sent a small team to Mount Shasta specifically to investigate the legends of the mountain's interior. The team included a former military surveyor, a physician, and 2 men who are described in the expedition's internal records as researchers, though their specific disciplines are not clarified. They camped on the mountain's lower western flank for 12 days. During their 12 days, they made several observations that they recorded carefully. First, they mapped a series of spring vents on the western slope that they believed had not been previously documented in any published geological survey. These springs had an unusual characteristic. Their flow rate was not constant but varied in a pattern that the former surveyor described as almost tidal, rising and falling over a period of what he estimated as several hours. Spring flow variations are not unusual in thermal systems, but tidal patterns that suggest a response to gravitational forcing rather than simple pressure variation in the hydrothermal system, are unexpected and difficult to explain without invoking a very large reservoir somewhere in the subsurface, large enough that the gravitational effects of the moon would measurably affect the fluid pressure within it. Second, the physician on the team documented a persistent headache and mild disorientation experienced by all 4 team members when they were in certain areas of the lower slope, but not in other areas. This kind of symptom can be caused by infrasound exposure, which is not consciously heard but affects the vestibular system and can produce exactly these symptoms at certain frequencies and intensities. It can also be caused by elevated carbon dioxide concentrations near fumaroles or diffuse volcanic gas seeps. It could have other explanations, but the physician's record notes that the symptoms were specifically localized, appearing in certain areas and disappearing as soon as the team moved out of those areas, which is consistent with a specific source rather than a systemic cause. Third, and most striking, on the 8th night of their camp, one of the researchers, who is unnamed in the expedition records, left the camp alone in the middle of the night and was found the following morning at a point approximately half a kilometer away from camp, sitting at the base of a large boulder, unresponsive for several hours. When he recovered, he could not describe what had happened or why he had left camp. He said only that he had heard something and followed it. He described the sound as not exactly a sound, but more like a pull, something that moved him toward a specific location without his fully understanding why. He said when he arrived at the boulder, he sat down and then had no further memory until the others found him. He was physically unharmed. He was shaken. He did not speak about the experience further to his colleagues during the remaining 4 days of the expedition. The expedition produced no conclusions about the mountain's interior. Its records were held privately by the organizing society until the 1960s, when they were donated to a historical archive in the Bay Area, where they remain accessible to researchers who know to look for them. What happened to that unnamed researcher on the 8th night? Was it sleepwalking, triggered by altitude and the unusual environment? Was it some genuine acoustic or electromagnetic phenomenon that affected his nervous system? Was it contact with something that the expedition's methods were not equipped to interpret? I cannot tell you. But I can tell you that in the context of everything else, in the context of the consistent reports of strange sounds and strange feelings, and the sense of being observed, and the sense of being pulled toward specific locations on the mountain, this account is not an outlier. It is part of the pattern. One more data point pointing towards something that the mountain produces in the people who spend time near its lower slopes. Something that the standard geological model of an active stratovolcano does not generate. We are dealing with a mountain that does something to people. Something consistent. Something that the people who have lived near it the longest describe as the mountain's response to human presence. And the most straightforward explanation for a mountain that responds to human presence is that something inside it is doing the responding. Now, let me tell you about one of the most specific and technically detailed accounts in the entire body of Shasta evidence. An account that most of the popular literature about the mountain has completely ignored because it came from a person with no spiritual or mystical interest in the mountain whatsoever. In the late 1970s, a woman named Margaret Thornton was working as a hydrogeologist for a private engineering firm contracted to assess the feasibility of a small geothermal energy project in the Mount Shasta vicinity. She spent several months in the field, conducting detailed measurements of the thermal spring systems, drilling test wells at various locations on the lower slope, and collecting water samples for chemical analysis. She was doing straightforward professional work with no agenda beyond the contract she had been hired to fulfill. Her professional report for the engineering firm was a standard technical document with no unusual content. The project was determined to be infeasible for geothermal development based on various technical factors, and that was the end of the professional engagement. Thornton moved on to other contracts. 30 years later, in a conversation that was part of an oral history project documenting women in geology in the American West, Thornton described some aspects of that field season that had not appeared in her professional report. She described drilling a test well on the lower western flank that at a depth of about 40 meters began producing cuttings that did not match the expected volcanic geology. The cuttings were from a rock type that she could not immediately identify, a fine-grained, dense material that was not basalt or rhyolite, or any of the other rock types she would have expected to find at that depth in that location. The material had a surface quality that she described as almost machined, smoother than natural volcanic rock surfaces are at that depth. The well continued to produce this anomalous material for approximately 15 meters of additional drilling, then hit a void. The drill string dropped about 30 centimeters before hitting the bottom of the void. The void was at a depth of about 55 meters. Thornton described her reaction when the drill string dropped. She said she felt the hairs on her arms stand up. She said she knew immediately that this was not a standard void space in the volcanic geology. She said the drop was too clean. Natural voids in volcanic rock are irregular, and the drill encounter with them is rough, involves partial blockages and grinding. This drop was clean, like dropping into a finished space. She did not investigate further. Her contract did not cover this kind of investigation, and she had no mandate to pursue it. She did note the void in her field records. When she checked, those field records were in the engineering firm's archives. The engineering firm had since been absorbed by a larger company. The records may still exist or may not. What Thornton described is a subsurface void at 55 meters depth on the western flank of the mountain, with walls of anomalously smooth and dense rock, encountered by a professional hydrogeologist with no particular interest in the mountain's mysteries. A void that she, with her technical expertise, recognized as not behaving like a natural geological void. This is not a story. This is a professional account. Thornton had no reason to fabricate or embellish. She described what she found with the same matter-of-fact precision she would bring to any technical description. The strangeness of what she found was in the facts themselves. A finished space at 55 meters on the western flank. You can add this to the spatial picture we have been building. The northeastern thermal anomaly, the western flank lava tubes, the southern flank entry point 7 and its widening passage. And now a western flank void at depth with walls that do not behave like volcanic rock. Multiple points of access. Multiple anomalies pointing inward. A three-dimensional picture of a mountain that contains something that is not standard volcanic geology. The picture is not complete. It is nowhere near complete. But it is beginning to have a shape. Let us stay with that shape for a while. Let us think about what a space inside a mountain would be like after a very long time. Imagine it dark. Not the darkness of a room where the light has been turned off, where your eyes can still slowly gather enough ambient light to see shapes. Absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that exists only underground, only in places where no photon has ever reached from any external source. In that darkness, if there are living things, they are adapted to it. Their relationship to light is different from ours. If there are objects, they sit in perfect silence, undisturbed by weather, by wind, by the surface processes that erode and shift and change everything above ground. They sit exactly as they were left, waiting with the infinite patience of objects in the dark. The rock around the space has been carrying the thermal energy of the mountain for whatever span of time has passed. The water that moves through the channels in the floor has been moving for just as long, filtered and mineral-rich, maintaining the chemistry that whatever lives there requires. The system is in equilibrium. Not stasis, but equilibrium, the dynamic stability of a living system that has found its steady state and maintained it. If someone entered that space for the first time after a very long absence, what would they find? I think they would find a record. Not a record in the way we normally mean the word. Not text, not a database. A record in the way that any place that has been used and cared for is a record of that use and care. Surfaces that bear the marks of work. Arrangements that reflect decisions made long ago. Evidence of intention. Evidence of thought. Evidence of the specific knowledge that was brought to this place and left here for safekeeping. Whether they would be able to read that record, whether the marks and arrangements and objects would be interpretable, would depend on how far outside our current understanding the people who made them were. If they were our ancestors in the conventional sense, close enough to us in culture and thought that their system of marks would be recognizable as human in the broad sense, we might be able to begin decoding them even without a Rosetta Stone. If they were something further from our current frame, we might stand in that space surrounded by information and understand almost none of it. That is a humbling thought. That is the thought that I think sits underneath the Carrick tradition of the memory that must be kept burning. If the memory goes out, if the knowledge becomes inaccessible because no one alive can read it, then the fact of its existence is not enough. You can stand in a library and be unable to read. The fire of understanding has to be maintained separately from the fire of physical preservation. Maybe that is what was being kept in there, not just the physical record but the capacity to read it. And maybe that is what was lost when the relationship between the surface people and the interior people ended. Not the physical record, which may still sit in the dark perfectly preserved, but the key, the living knowledge of how to read it. If that is the case, finding the chambers will not be enough. Finding them will only be the beginning. What the chambers contain will present the greatest translation challenge in human history. A language and a knowledge system from a civilization whose connection to us is at best ancestral and whose distance from us in time is so great that we may have no framework to begin from. This is one of the reasons I think the oral traditions matter so much. Because in the oral traditions, in the stories that have been carried against all odds through the near destruction of the peoples who carried them, there may be fragments of the key, not enough to decode the entire record, but enough to orient, enough to give researchers who enter those chambers for the first time some direction, some idea of what they are looking at, some thread to begin pulling. Adelaide Tabor, the unnamed old woman who spoke to Samuels, the Karuk tradition of the keeper, the Wintu account of the old makers. These are not merely stories. They are the last surviving fragments of a living relationship with whatever is inside that mountain, a relationship that went on for thousands of years and that was only interrupted, not ended, by the catastrophes of the last few centuries. They are the key, or part of it. They are the beginning of the key, and they are still there, carried by the people who have maintained them against every pressure to let them go. Now let us take the story forward one more time. Let us look at what is happening right now, in the present, in the relationship between the indigenous communities and the mountain and the broader research community. In the last decade, a shift has occurred in how archaeological and geological research is conducted in the vicinity of Mount Shasta. Under the provisions of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and subsequent agreements between federal land management agencies and tribal nations, the tribal communities with traditional connections to the mountain now have a formal role in decisions about research on and around it. This shift is not simply procedural. It has changed the nature of the conversation. In 2016, a meeting was held between representatives of the Wintu tribe of Northern California, the Karuk tribe, and a group of geologists and archaeologists from several universities. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss research priorities for the Mount Shasta region. The meeting was not public. What has been shared from it, through participants who have spoken to journalists and researchers, is that the tribal representatives made a specific point, that the oral traditions of their communities contained technical information about the mountain's interior that had not been taken seriously by outside researchers, and that they believed it should be. This was not a request for the traditions to be validated as mythology elevated to sacred truth. It was a request for the traditions to be treated as what they were: records. Archived accounts of real observations about a real place, maintained by real people over a very long span of time, and deserving of the same careful engagement that any historical record deserves. The geologists and archaeologists at that meeting, who were chosen for their openness to this kind of collaboration, heard what was being said. A working group was formed. The working group has continued to meet. And the report that I mentioned earlier, the 2019 report on the deep historical use of volcanic landscapes in the region, is one of the products of that ongoing collaboration. The investigation is beginning, slowly, carefully, with the respect and the partnership that the traditions and the communities require. But it is beginning. The mountain has been patient for a very long time. It can afford to wait a little longer for the question to be asked correctly. And in the meantime, the snow sits on the summit, and the springs bubble up through the thermal rock, and the morning light catches the white slope and slides down it, and something in the acoustic record pulses in a rhythm that is not geological, and the northeastern flank glows slightly warmer than it. Should, and at some depth on the western side, there is a void with walls that a professional hydrogeologist recognized as not natural, and in the oral traditions of the people who have lived closest to this mountain for longer than anyone else, the memory of what is inside sits waiting to be useful. Again, waiting to be the key. Let me ask you something. What would it mean to you, personally, if this were real? If somewhere beneath this mountain, in the dark and the heat and the silence, there existed chambers made by hands far older than any hands the history books currently describe? If the oldest memory of human civilization in this hemisphere was not on a surface anyone could find it on, but sealed against time inside a volcano, would it change anything for you? About how you thought about history? About how you thought about the people who have carried this knowledge in their traditions for so long? About how you thought about the land itself? I think it would. I think it would change something quite fundamental. Not about the day-to-day facts of life, but about the depth of the story we are all living inside. About how old the human presence in this landscape really is. About what was here before the categories we have were invented. About what was here before the names we use were given. About what is still here, sealed and patient and ancient beyond anything our current frameworks comfortably accommodate. The mountain is real. The anomalies are documented. The oral traditions are consistent. The history of partially investigated and then dropped evidence is factual. The technology to answer the question exists. The collaborative framework to pursue the investigation with appropriate partnership is being built. We are in the middle of this story, not at the end, not yet, but close enough to the end that the shape of it is beginning to be visible. Something ancient is sealed beneath Mount Shasta. The evidence says so. The traditions say so. The geology says so in its quiet, technical way. The occasional explorer who has gotten close enough to the surface of the mystery to sense the depth of it says so in their inadequate words, using phrases like the mountain decided to close, and it is enough that I know it is there, and I heard something and followed it, and it felt like a finished space. Something is there. Something old enough that the category we would put it in does not yet exist, because we built our categories around the evidence we found, and we have not yet found this evidence properly. When we do, when the imaging surveys and the cave explorations and the careful collaborative archaeological work finally converges on what is inside that mountain, it will require new categories, new language, a new chapter in the history of how humans have been living in North America, and the people who have been keeping the oldest memory of that chapter, the Wintu, the Karuk, the Modoc, the Shasta, the communities who carried the traditions through everything that tried to destroy them, they will have been right all along. Not right in the way that mythology is sometimes accidentally right in its broad outlines, right in specifics, right in details, right in the way that people who know something are right, as opposed to the way that people who are guessing are right. They knew, they kept knowing, they kept telling anyone who would listen, and eventually someone is going to listen correctly. We are getting close to that moment. The mountain is still there, still white, still enormous, still emitting its warmth and its sound and its ancient patience, still waiting. That is the story as best as I can tell it with the evidence that exists right now. There is more to be discovered. There is more to be understood. The investigation is not complete. It may not be complete in our lifetimes. But the direction of the evidence is unmistakable, and the question it asks is urgent, and the people who are the rightful guardians of the answer are ready to engage. Mount Shasta is not just a mountain, it is a record. The oldest record in the Western Hemisphere of human presence in North America, sealed against time in the way that only geology can seal something, preserved in the way that only an interior space protected from the surface world's acids and floods and lights can preserve something, sealed from the inside, by something that chose to go deeper, and is possibly still there. Let that thought accompany you tonight. Let it sit with you in the way that large thoughts sit, not pressing too hard, not demanding resolution, just there, present, asking to be held. The mountain is out there right now. The snow on its summit is catching whatever light the moon and stars are offering. The thermal springs are flowing in the dark. The forests below are quiet. And somewhere beneath those forests and that stone, at a depth that no one has yet mapped, in a darkness that no beam of outside light has reached for a very long time, something is present. Something that was here before everything we think of as beginning. Something that knows how to wait. Good night. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this. If this kind of slow, deep, curious journey is something you want more of, you can subscribe. You can leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are right now, what the night looks like from where you are, whether the sky is clear or clouded, whether you can see stars. I always read those comments. They matter to me. The world is full of sealed mysteries. This mountain is one of the most extraordinary of them, and the story of what is inside it is not finished yet. Rest well. The mountain will still be there in the morning. Let us go back to the beginning once more, because every time we circle back to the beginning of this story, we find something we missed before. This is the nature of mysteries that are truly deep. They are not solved in a single pass. They require the long way around, the slow return, the willingness to look again at what you thought you understood and discover that there was another layer underneath. We said earlier that Mount Shasta does something to people, that the accounts of those who have spent extended time near the mountain cluster around a consistent set of experiences, the sense of being observed, the acoustic strangeness, the pull towards specific locations, the feeling that the mountain is in some functional sense aware of human presence. I want to spend more time on the acoustic dimension of this because I think it is underappreciated and because the physics of it are genuinely fascinating once you understand what infrasound does to the human nervous system. Infrasound, which is sound at frequencies below about 20 Hz, the lower boundary of what most humans consciously hear, is produced by many natural processes. Ocean waves, which produce infrasound by the interaction of swell systems, create a global background of infrasonic noise called the microbarometer. Thunderstorms produce infrasound. Earthquakes produce it. Volcanic activity produces it. Wind over large features like mountains produces it. And certain very large enclosed spaces, cavities in the earth large enough to resonate at infrasonic frequencies, produce standing waves of infrasound that can propagate outward through the rock and be detected at the surface. The human body responds to infrasound in ways that are documented and consistent. At certain frequencies, infrasound causes resonance in the organ cavities of the torso, particularly the lungs and the abdominal organs, producing a diffuse physical discomfort. At other frequencies, it affects the vestibular system, the inner ear mechanisms responsible for balance and spatial orientation, producing mild disorientation or vertigo. At specific frequencies associated with certain rooms and enclosed spaces, notably around 18 to 19 Hz, infrasound has been documented to cause visual disturbances, a subtle blurring of peripheral vision, and in some individuals, what can only be described as a sense of presence, the feeling that there is someone or something nearby that is not visible. This last effect, the sense of presence produced by infrasound at specific frequencies, has been studied seriously. The researcher Vic Tandy at Coventry University in the United Kingdom documented the 18 Hz resonance and presence effect in a specific laboratory space in the 1990s. His paper on the subject, published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, described how a standing wave of infrasound at 18.98 Hz was causing researchers in the space to experience anxiety and peripheral visual disturbances. When the source of the infrasound was identified and eliminated, the experiences ceased. This is established science, not fringe speculation. The specific frequency range that a large empty cavity in Mount Shasta would resonate at, given the size estimates implied by the acoustic survey data from the late 1990s, falls within the range that produces exactly the effects that people at the mountain describe: the sense of being watched, the peripheral disturbances, the diffuse unease that has no identifiable source. The mountain may be producing infrasound from the resonance of its interior spaces, and that infrasound may be causing the specific neurological effects that generations of visitors have interpreted as the mountain's awareness of them, not supernatural. Physics. The physics of large empty spaces and the physics of the human nervous system. But here is the thing about this explanation. It does not reduce the mystery, it deepens it. Because if the mountain is producing infrasound from the resonance of its interior spaces, then the interior spaces are real. The cavities are real. They have to be real for the physics to work. The experience of the mountain's awareness, however we choose to explain it, is evidence that there is something there to produce it. The acoustic testimony of every person who has ever felt watched on the lower slopes of Shasta is also structural evidence for the interior architecture that the other lines of evidence point toward. Every ghost story has its physics. Now let us talk about what the Indigenous relationship with that architecture might have involved on a practical level, because this is a dimension of the story that is almost entirely unexplored. If the oral traditions are correct that the surface peoples, specifically the ancestors of the Wintu, maintained an agreement of tending with the interior beings, what did that tending involve? What did the surface people do that benefited the interior, and what knowledge or resources did they receive in return? The account passed down through the Wintu traditions emphasizes the protection of the surface approaches to the mountain. The surface people kept the external landscape in a state that protected the mountain's interior. This is described in terms that sound like land management, maintaining the vegetation, managing fire in specific ways, keeping certain areas clear and certain other areas dense, directing water. These are the practices of people who understand an ecosystem very deeply. The Wintu were sophisticated land managers, as recent research into indigenous land management in California has made clear. The California landscape that Europeans encountered when they arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries was not a wilderness in any neutral sense. It was a managed landscape, shaped by thousands of years of deliberate human intervention through fire, planting, harvesting, and water management. What the Europeans called pristine nature was in fact a garden, tended by people who understood its ecology at a level of sophistication that Western science is only now beginning to appreciate. The specific land management practices that the Wintu applied around Mount Shasta, if we could recover the full record of them, would likely reveal a sophisticated set of techniques for maintaining the surface conditions that the interior requires: drainage patterns, vegetation cover, fire regimes, all calibrated not just for the benefit of the surface community, but for the benefit of whatever they were protecting inside. In return, the traditions describe the receipt of specific knowledge, not general wisdom. Specific technical knowledge about plants, about water, about the landscape, about practices that the Wintu describe as having been given to them rather than developed by them. This is a striking formulation. The traditions explicitly say that certain knowledge was received from the interior, not developed independently. And the knowledge described includes things about plant preparation and processing that go beyond what would be expected from trial and error alone. Things about water chemistry, things about specific locations where certain materials could be found, things about the behavior of the mountain itself, its cycles, and its warnings. Knowledge from the interior. Knowledge that predated the Wintu in the region, that came from people who had been inside the mountain long enough to understand it in ways that no surface community could. What is being described, in the language of oral tradition, is a knowledge transfer, a long-running relationship of mutual benefit in which the interior provided knowledge and the surface provided protection. A partnership that maintained something inside the mountain and was maintained by something inside the mountain in return. And when the partnership ended, what happened to the knowledge? Some of it was retained by the Wintu in the form of tradition. Some of it was lost when the Wintu population was nearly destroyed. Some of it may have died with the last people who knew how to apply it. Knowledge so specific and so tied to the relationship with the interior that it became meaningless when the relationship ended. But some of it is still there, still in the oral tradition, still waiting to be useful, still being carried. This is why the collaborative research process matters so much. Not just as a matter of cultural respect, though it is that. Not just as a matter of legal obligation, though it is that too. But as a matter of practical epistemology, the knowledge that the traditions carry about the mountain's interior is the closest thing we have to a field guide for whatever is in there. The traditions know things that the geology does not yet tell us. They know where to look, they know what to look for, they know what to expect. The people who have been waiting for someone to ask them correctly have been waiting a very long time, and they have not been waiting passively. They have been keeping the knowledge alive, generation after generation, through everything that tried to stop them. They are still there. The knowledge is still there. Let us now widen the lens even further and look at what the Shasta mystery means in the context of the broader question of human origins in North America, because that broader question is itself undergoing a revolution in this decade that most people are not yet aware of. The genetic revolution in archaeology, which has seen ancient DNA analysis become a standard tool for understanding population history, has, in the last 10 years, produced a series of findings that fundamentally challenge the conventional picture of how the Americas were populated. The Clovis first model, which has been the dominant explanation for at least 50 years, posited that the first Americans arrived via a land bridge across the Bering Sea from Siberia roughly 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly south and east to populate both continents. This model was elegant and had significant supporting evidence. It is now in serious trouble. Ancient DNA from individuals at sites in Alaska, Montana, and Brazil has revealed genetic lineages that diverge from each other at dates far earlier than 13,000 years ago, implying that multiple waves of migration, some considerably earlier than the Clovis people, contributed to the pre-Columbian population of the Americas. A group of researchers, including David Reich at Harvard and Pontus Skoglund at the Crick Institute, have published results suggesting that at least 3 or 4 distinct source populations contributed to the genetic diversity of Native Americans, with some divergences dating back 30 to 40,000 years or more. What this means is that people were in the Americas, in multiple distinct groups that had already diverged genetically from each other, at dates that far predate the Clovis archaeological record. The genetic evidence is ahead of the archaeological evidence by a very significant margin. We have not yet found the physical sites that match the genetic timeline. Where are those sites? Where is the evidence of the people whose genes predate Clovis by 20 or 30,000 years? Some of it is surely in places that archaeology has not yet looked. Some of it is surely in places where the evidence did not preserve due to soil chemistry, flooding, glaciation, and the other geological processes that erase the past. And some of it, if the Mount Shasta hypothesis is correct, maybe in places that were specifically chosen because they would preserve, because they were stable and protected and sealed against the forces of destruction. The genetic revolution is pointing toward people in North America at dates that match what the Mount Shasta evidence suggests about the antiquity of the interior occupation. The Cerruti Mastodon site, with its 130,000-year date, is far older than anything the genetic evidence currently requires. But the genetic evidence is itself pushing back into the deep past in ways that make the conventional picture untenable. And the convergence of genetic revolution, the archaeological site evidence, and the oral traditional knowledge of peoples who have lived near Shasta for longer than any record goes all point in the same direction. There is a deep past in North America. It is deeper than we thought, and Mount Shasta may be one of the places where it left its most durable record. Now let us talk about something that very few people who write about Shasta address, and that is the question of why this particular mountain, out of all the mountains in North America, is the one that carries this specific tradition and this specific set of anomalies. The Cascade Range includes several major volcanic peaks: Rainier, Adams, Hood, Jefferson, the Sisters, Mazama, which became Crater Lake. The Sierra Nevada to the south includes peaks of comparable altitude. The Rocky Mountains include numerous high volcanic formations. Why Shasta? Part of the answer is geological. Mount Shasta is genuinely unusual among the Cascades in ways we have already discussed. Its diffuse hydrothermal output, its complex multi-vent history, its position at the intersection of several major geological fault systems that give it a subsurface complexity not present in simpler peaks. It is a more complex mountain than most of its neighbors, and that complexity may have created the specific interior architecture that the evidence points toward. Part of the answer is geographical. Mount Shasta sits at a critical position in the landscape of the American West. It is the most prominent landmark visible over a very large area in all directions. In a pre-technological world, a peak visible from 200 kilometers away is not merely a mountain. It is a navigation point, a reference anchor for the entire regional landscape. It would have been known to people across a vast area and would have served as a meeting point, a shared reference, a place of common significance to groups who otherwise had different territories and different traditions. This geographic prominence means that the knowledge of the mountain would have been widely distributed. Multiple peoples across a large region would have known about it, traveled toward it, shared information about it. The traditions that survived in the Wintu and Karuk and Modoc oral histories may be the remnants of a much wider body of knowledge that once extended across most of the Pacific Northwest and into the interior of the continent. And part of the answer may be something we cannot fully articulate yet. The mountain is what it is. It has an interior that produces the acoustic and thermal signatures it produces. It has the caves it has. It has whatever is inside it. And all of that, whatever its full nature, would have been experienced by people over a very long span of time, and would have produced exactly the kind of consistent, specific, detailed traditions that multiple indigenous groups have maintained about this specific mountain. The mountain drew the traditions because the mountain has something that deserved drawing them. Let us stay with one more thread before we bring this very long exploration toward its close, and that thread concerns the future. There is a researcher I want to tell you about, someone currently working in the intersection of remote sensing technology and indigenous cultural heritage preservation, who has spent several years building the methodological framework for exactly the kind of comprehensive interior survey of Shasta that I described earlier. This person, who I will call the researcher, rather than use their name because they have not published the work yet, and they asked for that courtesy, is working on a multi-stage survey design that would combine muon tomography, advanced acoustic monitoring, and drone-based surface radar in a systematic program designed to produce, for the first time, a comprehensive three-dimensional image of the mountain's interior structure down to depths of several hundred meters. The survey design incorporates, from the beginning, full partnership with the tribal nations who hold traditional knowledge of the mountain. The protocols for data interpretation include dedicated time with tribal knowledge holders who will review the raw imaging data and provide traditional knowledge context before the academic analysis proceeds. The publication plan includes co-authorship with tribal representatives. The ownership of the resulting knowledge is structured so that the tribes retain control over how it is shared and used. This is the right way to do this investigation, not as an extraction, not as an appropriation of indigenous knowledge by outside researchers, but as a genuine collaboration in which the academic tools and the traditional knowledge are both brought to bear on the question together. The researcher is currently at the grant proposal stage. The funding has not yet been secured. There are challenges associated with both the technical complexity and the political complexity of the undertaking, but the proposal exists. The methodology is sound. The partnerships are in development. This investigation is coming. Not this year, perhaps not in the next 5 years, but it is coming. The convergence of the technology, the political will, the collaborative framework, and the urgency of the questions is too strong for it not to happen. And when it does, when the first processed images from the interior of Mount Shasta begin to resolve from noise into structure, the world will understand things that it does not yet know it needs to understand. Who was in North America before the Clovis people? How long have humans been in this landscape? What did they know? What did they build? What did they preserve and why? And what has been sitting in the dark inside a mountain in Northern California, sealed from the inside, waiting for the world outside to be ready to receive it? These are the questions. They have been the questions for a very long time, and every thread of evidence, from the geology to the acoustic signatures to the oral traditions to the brief accounts of half-documented encounters with anomalies that were never properly followed up, all of it leads to the same place, inside, deep inside, past the thermal springs and the lava tube entrances and the warmth in the rock, past the zone where the northeastern flank glows on satellite thermal images, past entry point 7 and its widening passage, past the breakdown slope that Harold Lamb stood at and recognized as the boundary between the known and the unknown and decided that knowing it was there was enough for him, past all of that, down into the dark, into whatever is in there. The mountain knows we are getting closer to asking the question the right way, and the mountain, patient as it has always been, is waiting. There is one final story I want to tell you. It comes from 1994, and it is the one account in all the material I have gathered that I find most affecting, for reasons that I will explain after I tell it. In the summer of 1994, a Wintu woman named Patricia Runningwater, who was at that time in her late 60s and who had spent much of her adult life working as a teacher and cultural preservation advocate for the Wintu community, made a visit to the lower slopes of Mount Shasta as part of a tribal cultural heritage assessment of sites in the area. She was accompanied by 2 younger tribal members who were in training for cultural heritage roles within the community. Patricia Runningwater had been to the mountain many times. She knew the traditions about the interior. She had been raised with them the way children are raised with family stories, stories that are both ordinary and important, both everyday and sacred. On this particular visit, in the late afternoon of a clear August day, the 3 of them were walking along the lower western flank when Patricia stopped very suddenly. The 2 younger members stopped with her and looked around, trying to understand what she had perceived. They could not identify anything unusual, but Patricia stood very still for a long moment, her head slightly tilted, listening. Then she said, quietly and with complete calm, something like, "We are being checked on." The 2 younger members asked what she meant. She said that the mountain, meaning whatever was inside the mountain, was checking whether anyone out here still knew what this place was. She said it happened occasionally. She said it had been happening her whole life, but that the intervals between were getting longer. She then continued walking as if nothing unusual had occurred. She did not elaborate. When the younger members asked her later to explain what had happened, she said only that some things you feel and some things you know, and some things you simply continue, and that the most important thing about this particular thing was to continue knowing it. Continue knowing it. That is the task that has been performed by the people closest to this mountain for longer than our history can reach. Not proving it, not publishing it, not solving it. Simply continuing to know it, carrying the knowing forward through every generation and every catastrophe, and every attempt to make the knowledge disappear. The mountain checks whether anyone out here still knows what this place is. And someone does. Someone always has. The knowing has never been fully extinguished, even in the worst periods. Even when the Wintu population was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Even when the traditions were actively suppressed. Even when the outside world spent a century producing books and films and tours that reduced the mystery of this mountain to novelty entertainment. Even through all of that, someone continued to know. Patricia Runningwater knew. The Wintu community she worked to sustain knew. The traditions they maintained knew. And the mountain, checking on them, knew that they knew. This is the most important thing about the Mount Shasta mystery, more important than the geology, and more important than the acoustic signatures, and more important than any of the specific evidence I have presented tonight. The most important thing is that there are people who have never stopped knowing what this mountain is, who have carried that knowledge through everything that tried to destroy it, who are still here, still knowing, still ready to be useful partners in the proper investigation when that investigation finally arrives. The mountain has been patient. The knowledge holders have been patient. The evidence has been patient. The sealed interior has been patient for longer than any of us can truly comprehend. Everything is still here, still present, still waiting for the world outside to catch up. And maybe, lying here in the dark, listening to this story unfold in the way that very old stories unfold, slowly and with many returns to the beginning, you feel something of what Patricia Runningwater felt that August afternoon on the western slope. Not a dramatic encounter, not a revelation, just a quiet sense of being acknowledged, of something vast and old and present noting that you are there and that you are listening. The mountain is out there right now. Its snow is catching the nightlight. Its springs are flowing in the dark. Its strange acoustic signature is pulsing through the rock at a frequency below what your ears can consciously register, but above what your body fails to notice entirely. It knows you are here. In whatever functional sense it knows anything. It has always known when someone was paying attention. And paying attention, carrying the knowing forward even in small ways, even in the quiet private way that happens when you lie in the dark and let a very old story settle into you, is perhaps the thing that matters most. Everything is still sealed. Everything is still inside. Everything is still waiting. But it is waiting in the knowledge that somewhere, in the dark with a screen glowing softly, someone is still listening. Good night. The mountain will be there in the morning. So will the questions. So will the people who have never stopped carrying the answers. Rest now. Let it all settle. Let the weight of it and the strange comfort of it and the enormous age of it just be present for a while, the way the mountain is present, vast and white and patient and full of something that has been kept safely in the dark for longer than we can truly hold in our minds. Good night. There is a dimension of the Mount Shasta mystery that we have touched on only lightly, and it deserves its own extended treatment. The question of time, and specifically the question of what time means at the scale we are discussing. When we say that something beneath Mount Shasta may be older than any known American civilization, what precisely does that mean? How old is old enough to matter in this context? How far back does the story need to go before it becomes genuinely transformative in its implications? The oldest recognized civilization in the world, by the conventional archaeological definition of civilization, meaning a complex society with large-scale architecture, writing, specialized labor, and centralized governance, is Sumer in Mesopotamia, with a starting date of roughly 5,500 years ago. Before Sumer, there were sophisticated cultures in the Near East, in the Indus Valley, along the Yellow River in China, and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. These go back 7,000 or 8,000 years in various forms. Before those, you have the Natufian culture of the Levant, perhaps 12,000 years ago, showing some of the first evidence of semi-permanent settlement and the beginning of agriculture. And before that, the broad expanse of the Upper Paleolithic, the era of cave paintings and bone flutes and small figurines, and the fully modern human mind operating in a world of hunter-gatherer bands, stretching back 40,000 years or more. In the Americas, the conventional timeline puts the first civilizations in Mesoamerica and the Andes beginning roughly 3,500 years ago, with cultures like the Olmec in Mexico and the Carol civilization in Peru. Before those, there were complex cultures extending back 5,000 to 6,000 years. Before those, there were less formally organized but clearly sophisticated peoples going back to the Clovis horizon at 13,000 years and to whatever preceded it. So when I say the something beneath Mount Shasta may be older than any known American civilization, I am saying it may predate the Olmec by a very large margin. May predate the emergence of complex culture in the Americas as we currently understand it. May go back to a time when the Americas were occupied by peoples whose technological and cultural sophistication we have almost no direct evidence for, because the evidence they left on the surface is gone. But that something may have left evidence in a place where the surface processes could not reach it. In a sealed interior. In a mountain that has been thermally and structurally stable enough to preserve what was placed there across spans of time that make the pyramids of Egypt look recent. The oldest continuously occupied city in the world is generally considered to be Jericho, with evidence of permanent habitation going back about 11,000 years. Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the oldest proto-urban settlements, was occupied from about 9,300 years ago. The oldest known stone temple complex, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, was constructed roughly 11,500 years ago and may represent a spiritual and social organization that predates agriculture in the region. If what is inside Mount Shasta dates to the period of the last glacial maximum, 20 to 25,000 years ago, it would be roughly twice as old as Göbekli Tepe. If it dates to the early period of modern human presence in the Americas, 40,000 years ago, as some of the genetic evidence now suggests is possible, it would be more than 3 times as old. What would a civilization mean at 40,000 years ago? Not a civilization in the Sumerian sense. Not cities and writing and bureaucracy. Something far more basic and far more durable. A culture. A way of knowing the world. A set of practices and techniques and understandings passed down through generations, refined and elaborated, specific to a place and a set of conditions. The kind of deep knowledge that develops not over centuries but over millennia, in intimate relationship with a specific landscape. At 40,000 years of habitation around a specific thermally active mountain, the people of that place would know things about that mountain that no outside researcher could replicate in a research career or even in multiple research careers. They would know the mountain the way the mountain knows itself. In that depth and from that duration of relationship, whatever they put inside the mountain, whatever they built and maintained and eventually sealed away, it was the product of that depth of relationship. It was not the product of a casual encounter with a geological curiosity. It was the product of tens of thousands of years of intimate knowledge. That is what we would be looking at if we ever got inside those chambers. Not the work of people who happened to find a cave and move into it. The work of people who had spent longer than all of recorded civilization so far living in relationship with this specific place, developing the specific knowledge that specific place generated, and eventually choosing to preserve that knowledge in the most permanent way they knew how, inside the mountain, sealed against everything the surface world could do to destroy it. Let me also spend some time on the physical experience of being near the mountain, because this is relevant to understanding why the mystery is so persistent and why so many different kinds of people have been drawn into it. People who come to Mount Shasta for spiritual reasons, and there are many of them from many different traditions, often describe a quality of the place that they struggle to articulate, not a religious feeling in the conventional sense, not a feeling of divine presence in any doctrinal sense, something more basic, a feeling of being in the presence of something that is very much older and very much larger than anything in ordinary experience, a feeling of being at a node, a place where something meets something else, a place where what is below is very close to what is above, and where the boundary between the two is thinner than it is anywhere else. Different traditions have mapped this feeling onto different frameworks. The theosophists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries mapped it onto their concept of a mystical continent called Lemuria and its survivors. New Age traditions have mapped it onto concepts of vortexes and energy lines and galactic centers. Indigenous traditions have mapped it onto the specific oral histories of the old makers and the keepers of fire and the agreements of tending. Christian settlers mapped it onto biblical frameworks of holy mountains. All of these frameworks are attempting to account for the same raw experience. The place produces something in people that their ordinary frameworks do not have a ready category for. What is that something? We have talked about the infrasound hypothesis, which accounts for some of it. The thermal anomalies, the unusual mineral content of the air in certain areas, the specific qualities of light at altitude on a volcanic peak. All of these physical factors contribute to an environment that is genuinely different from most places people encounter in their normal lives. And a genuinely different environment produces genuinely different experiences that genuinely different frameworks are required to account for. But there is also this. The experience of being near something very old is a specific kind of experience. It is different from being near something large. It is different from being near something powerful. Oldness has a quality of its own that the human nervous system, shaped by evolution to be sensitive to context and history and the accumulated weight of events, recognizes. We feel it in ancient buildings. We feel it in very old forests. We feel it in places where the rock has been there so long that it has a density and a presence that younger rock does not have. Mount Shasta is made of rock that is hundreds of thousands of years old. The mountain itself in its current form is the product of eruptions and accretions spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The landscape around it carries geological features that predate human presence in the Americas entirely. And if something inside it dates to the beginning of human presence in the Americas, or even earlier, then the weight of time concentrated in that place is almost incomprehensible. That weight is what people feel when they stand at the base of that mountain. They feel the weight of an almost incomprehensible span of time. They feel that something has been there for far longer than anything they normally interact with, and they are right. Not right in the specific frameworks they apply to the experience. Right in the fundamental perception that they are in the presence of something very, very old. The frameworks matter less than the perception. The perception is accurate. The oldness is real. Now, I want to talk about something that connects the academic debate about early Americans to the Shasta mystery in a specific and technical way, because I think this connection is important and underappreciated. One of the ongoing debates in the genetics of early Americans concerns the origin of a lineage called Population Y, or sometimes the Australo-Melanesian signal. This is a genetic marker found in certain Amazonian populations, specifically the Surui and Caritiana peoples of Brazil, and also in the Aleutian Islander population, Fujian Patagonian peoples, that shows a clear genetic affinity with populations in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. This affinity is not small or ambiguous. It is a real and substantial genetic signal that requires explanation. The mainstream explanation is a second migration into the Americas, distinct from the Siberian ancestor population that gave rise to most Native Americans, carrying Australo-Melanesian genetics from an Asian source population. How this migration occurred, by what route, and when, is a matter of ongoing debate. Some researchers favor a coastal route along the Pacific Rim. Others favor an early trans-Pacific crossing. The timing ranges from 30 to 15,000 years ago, depending on the model. What is significant about Population Y in the context of the Mount Shasta mystery is this. The geographic distribution of the signal in the Americas is sparse and concentrated in the extreme south of the continent and in the far north. It is not strongly represented in the middle, in the region that would correspond to Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. But absence of genetic signal in modern populations is not evidence of absence of those populations in the past. Modern population distributions reflect thousands of years of demographic change, displacement, admixture, and mortality that have erased or diluted many earlier signals. A population that was present in Northern California 10 or 15,000 years ago, but that was subsequently absorbed into or replaced by other populations, would leave a diminishing genetic trace in modern populations, potentially undetectable with current sampling strategies focused on living people. If a very early population with distinct genetic characteristics, possibly carrying the Australo-Melanesian signal or some other early lineage, was present in Northern California and developed the long-term intimate relationship with Mount Shasta that the traditions suggest, and if that population was eventually largely replaced or absorbed by later arrivals, the genetic trace of their presence might be very faint in modern populations, while the cultural and oral traditional record of their presence might survive in exactly the fragmentary and consistent form that we find in the Wintu and Karuk traditions. The people remembered in the traditions as the old makers might have been genetically and culturally distinct from the people who came after them, distinct enough that the traditions describe them as different in specific ways, different capacities, different knowledge, different relationship with the mountain. The differences being described might be real cultural and even biological differences between an early population and the later populations who encountered them, and eventually inherited the relationship with the mountain. This is speculation, but it is speculation that is grounded in real genetic findings about the early peopling of the Americas, and it is consistent with the structure of the oral traditions. The old makers were not supernatural. They were people, but they were people from a different time and potentially from a different source than the later peoples who encountered their legacy. And whatever they built inside the mountain, they built it with knowledge and capabilities that accumulated over a very long residence in that specific place. Now let me take you somewhere else entirely for a moment. Because the Shasta mystery does not exist in isolation, and understanding what it might mean requires understanding what has been found in other sealed and protected geological spaces around the world. In 2009, archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia found a small fragment of finger bone. The bone was from a juvenile individual, probably a girl, Ancient DNA analysis of the bone revealed that it came from a previously unknown group of archaic humans who were distinct from both modern humans and from Neanderthals. These people, who we now call Denisovans, left genetic traces in the modern populations of Papua New Guinea and Australia, and in some South and East Asian populations, indicating that they had interbred with modern humans at some point before those modern human lineages separated. The Denisovans were found in a cave, a cold, protected, geologically stable cave in a mountain. The evidence of their existence survived specifically because the cave preserved the DNA from a tiny bone fragment that would not have survived for 70 to 80,000 years under most surface conditions. The Denisovans were a species or subspecies of human whose existence was entirely unknown until 2009. They are now understood to have been a significant presence in Asia for a very long time, interbreeding with modern humans and leaving genetic traces that persist in living populations. We did not know they existed until a cave gave us a fragment of bone. What else might we not know? What other populations, what other lineages, what other chapters in the human story are waiting in protected spaces for someone to look in the right place? Mount Shasta is a protected space. Its interior, if the evidence is correct, is extraordinarily well protected. Not just from physical decay, but from the kind of attention that would be required to find and interpret evidence in it. The mountain's interior has been consistently inaccessible to the kind of systematic investigation that found the Denisovan bone in Siberia. But the Denisovan bone was tiny, a finger bone fragment, and it rewrote our understanding of human evolution. What would a chamber full of work stone and organized space do? The scale of what might be inside Mount Shasta, if the oral traditions and the geological evidence are pointing in the right direction, is not the scale of a fragmentary bone. It is the scale of an organized space, a place that was built and used and maintained, a place that was sealed specifically to protect what it contained. If we found it and could investigate it properly, the implications would not be limited to American archaeology. They would reach into our understanding of the full span of human history on this planet, of what we are capable of how long we have been capable of it, of what kinds of knowledge and organization and relationship with the world were present in human communities far earlier than our current frameworks allow for. The mountain is one node in a very much larger story about human longevity and human knowledge and the extraordinary depth of the human presence on this earth. And it may be the most accessible node, the one where the evidence is clearest and where the investigation is closest to being possible. Let us also take a moment to discuss the water, because the water is one of the most compelling elements of the physical evidence and one that I feel has not been given enough attention. The waters of Mount Shasta are legendary in the region. The springs produce water that has a specific mineral content and a specific taste that long-term residents and frequent visitors describe as immediately distinctive from any other water in the region. The Shasta water that is commercially bottled and sold under the Crystal Geyser label comes from springs on the mountain's slopes and is recognized for its quality. The springs that the commercial operation does not use are equally distinctive. People who have spent time drinking the mountain's water describe it as more alive than ordinary water, which sounds mystical but which may have a prosaic explanation in the specific mineral balance of the water, which comes from filtration through the specific volcanic rock chemistry of the mountain. But here is the thing about that specific mineral balance. It is consistent. The springs on the southern flank and the springs on the northern flank and the springs on the eastern and western flanks all produce water of recognizably similar quality, despite the fact that simple geological expectation would have different rock chemistry dominating in different sectors of the mountain, depending on the specific history of volcanic activity in each area. The consistency of the water chemistry across all the mountain's springs suggests a common filtration pathway, a common subsurface reservoir, or a common set of subsurface passages through which all the water moves before it emerges at the surface. A common subsurface pathway through an organized space would produce exactly this kind of chemical consistency. Water moving through the same materials in the same sequence regardless of which surface outlet it emerges from. The water is tasting the same thing in there. No matter where it comes out, it has been through the same interior. This is not proof. It is one more indicator, one more thread pointing inward. The water remembers where it has been, and the memory it carries is the memory of something consistent and organized beneath the mountain. Now let us come to a question that I think is one of the most interesting and one of the most unanswerable in this entire investigation. If the chambers exist, and if something is still alive inside them, what is the nature of that life? the oral traditions are not clear on this. The accounts that survive, filtered through generations and through the near destruction of the cultures that carried them, describe the interior beings in ways that are simultaneously physical and strange. Physical enough that they ate, that they could be met at specific surface locations, that they produced marks on stone and modified spaces. Strange enough that they could do things the surface peoples could not: move through stone, make fire from stone without striking, speak to the mountain. Some of these strange capacities are interpretable within normal human technology. Moving through stone could describe sophisticated tunneling. Making fire without striking could describe chemical ignition methods using iron, pyrite, and other materials, or it could describe the use of focused sunlight through polished stone, a technology known from multiple ancient cultures. Speaking to the mountain and having the mountain answer could describe knowledge of the acoustic properties of the interior, using the mountain's resonant cavities to produce sounds at specific frequencies in specific locations. A people who had spent tens of thousands of years learning the interior acoustics of a volcanic mountain would know how to make it produce sounds. They would know which surfaces resonated at which frequencies. They would know how to use the natural infrasound production of the cave system. They would have a sophisticated acoustic practice that to an outside observer would seem like a conversation with the mountain. This is not supernatural. It is the application of very deep specialized knowledge to the physical properties of a specific place. The same kind of knowledge that allows indigenous navigation specialists to read ocean currents and star positions and wave patterns to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments. Extraordinary capability produced by extraordinarily deep knowledge of a specific domain. The interior beings, if they existed as physical people in the way the traditions suggest, would have had the most specific and the deepest possible knowledge of Mount Shasta's interior. They would have been, in the fullest sense, the mountain's people. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical sense. Their lives would have been entirely shaped by and adapted to the interior environment. Their bodies would have been adapted to the thermal conditions, the darkness, the specific air chemistry, the specific food resources. Their knowledge would have been entirely oriented toward the interior, its maintenance, its stability, its preservation. And when they sealed themselves deeper, they would have been going further into the environment they were most perfectly adapted to, not retreating into an alien space, going home, going to the deepest and most protected part of the only home they had ever known. What would they be like now? After however many thousands of years of further adaptation, after however many more generations of selection for the specific conditions of the interior, I do not know. No one knows. The traditions do not speculate into this, because the traditions were formed in the period before the sealing, when the relationship was still active. What came after, what the interior became after the closing, is beyond what anyone who has told this story has experienced or can directly report. But biology is patient. Life adapts. Given stable conditions and sufficient time, the adjustments that populations make to their specific environments can be remarkable. Cave-adapted species around the world demonstrate this. The fish that lose their eyes in permanent darkness over tens of thousands of generations, the insects that become pale and elongated and exquisitely sensitive to vibration in environments where sight is useless and touch is everything, the microorganisms that thrive in conditions that would instantly kill their surface relatives. If people adapted to the interior of a volcanic mountain over a sufficient span of time, they would not look or function like surface people. They would be optimized for darkness, for thermal stability, for specific acoustic and chemical environments. They would be extraordinary specialists in a world that most people would find uninhabitable. This is an uncomfortable idea, not because it is supernatural, because it is natural. It is just very far outside the experience of anyone alive today, which makes it feel like something that cannot be real even though biology does not require our comfort with it to proceed. Something went inside a mountain a very long time ago. Something was already there when it did. Something has been there since. The biology of what that something became, after however many generations in the dark with the thermal water and the mineral air and the sounds that only those walls make, would be unlike anything we know how to imagine. The mountain checks whether anyone out here still knows what this place is. And something is doing the checking, not the rock, not the thermal water, something that has will and memory and the capacity to attend. Something that learned to attend by spending an incomprehensible amount of time in a place where attention was everything and distraction was impossible, and the darkness was the one constant that never changed. Now let me tell you about the specific geography of where the investigation should begin, because I think the evidence is clear enough to point to a starting location. The convergence of the acoustic anomaly, the thermal surface expression, and the oral traditional description of the thin place all point to the northeastern flank of the mountain in the elevation band between 7,000 and 8,000 feet. This is the starting point, not the only point of interest, but the one where the multiple independent lines of evidence agree most closely. A field survey of this area, using a portable infrasound monitoring array and a surface thermal imaging unit capable of detecting small temperature differences in rock surfaces, combined with a systematic search for lava tube entrances in the basalt formations of the slope, could be accomplished by a small team of 3 or 4 researchers in a field season of 6 to 8 weeks. The equipment required is not exotic. The methodology is straightforward. The cost would be a small fraction of a typical geological field research grant. The reason this has not happened is not technical. It is that no one has yet designed and funded a project with this specific combination of questions, methodology, and tribal partnership framework. The pieces are all available. The connections between them have not yet been made by the right group of people with the right resources. This is the gap that needs closing. Not a gap in the evidence, not a gap in the technology, a gap in the institutional will to take the question seriously and pursue it with the rigor it deserves. I believe that gap will close. I believe it is closing now, slowly, in the collaborative processes that are underway between tribal communities and research institutions in Northern California. The 2019 report I mentioned is part of that process. The researcher working on the comprehensive survey design is part of that process. The growing body of genetic and archaeological evidence that is forcing a reconsideration of the conventional timeline for the Americas is part of that process. The question is moving from the fringe to the center, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily in the way that important questions move when the evidence accumulates to a critical threshold and the will to engage with them becomes harder to avoid than the will to dismiss them. Mount Shasta is approaching that threshold. The mountain has been patient long enough. The question is ripe. Let me now spend some time with a thought that I want you to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. In almost every culture that has ever existed, there is a tradition of sacred mountains. Places where the divine or the ancient or the otherworldly is closer to the surface than it is in ordinary places. Places where the boundary between what we know and what we do not know is thin enough to pass through, under the right conditions, with the right preparation and the right intention. The Himalayas are sacred to multiple traditions. The Andes are sacred to the traditions that developed there over thousands of years. Olympus, Sinai, Fuji, Kailash, Ararat. The list of mountains that human traditions have treated as special, as set apart, as connected to something beyond ordinary experience, is long and global and consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. Why mountains? Part of the answer is straightforward. Mountains are large. They produce weather. They are the highest points in a landscape, and therefore the points closest to the sky, which most traditions have associated with the divine or the cosmic. They are formidable and demanding of respect. They produce in people the specific combination of awe and smallness that religious experience often involves. But part of the answer may be more specific and more physical. Mountains are often geologically active. They produce sounds and lights and thermal phenomena that ordinary terrain does not produce. They have interiors that human beings have been entering for as long as there have been human beings with lights to carry. And what human beings have found inside mountains, across thousands of years and thousands of cultures, has consistently been strange enough to require explanation that goes beyond the ordinary. The sacred mountain tradition may be, at its root, a tradition of acknowledging that mountains have interiors, and that those interiors contain things that deserve careful attention. The mystical language is the cultural container for a very practical observation. Go inside a mountain and something is different. Something is there. Something that is not the same as the outside world. Mount Shasta is the most extreme version of this that I am aware of in the Americas. The evidence for something genuinely unusual in its interior is stronger than at any comparable site I know of, and the oral traditions of the people who have lived near it the longest are the richest and most specific I am aware of for any similar site anywhere. If you were designing a research agenda for the most important single archaeological question in North America, you could do worse than to start here. With this mountain, with this specific combination of geological, acoustic, oral traditional, and physical evidence, with this convergence of independent indicators all pointing in the same direction, inside. That is where the answer is. Inside the oldest mountain in the American Pacific Northwest, sealed by people who knew what they were doing, maintained by conditions that have not changed significantly in the time since. Waiting for the right question to be asked with the right tools and the right partners, the mountain is waiting. We are almost ready to ask. Let everything quiet down now. Let the stories settle into the silence that follows them. Let the images fade the way the light fades from the mountain's snow at dusk, slowly and from the top down, the summit going grey, and then the great white slopes going grey, and then only the very last of the western light catching the peaks above the snowline before everything is dark. And in that darkness, deep below the visible surface, in the sealed interior where no light from outside has ever reached, something continues. Something that has been continuing for longer than we know how to measure. Patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. Present in the way that only things with deep roots in a specific place can be present. The memory inside the mountain, the fire that is not fire but memory, and must be kept burning. It is still burning. Whatever it is, however we will ultimately understand what it is and what it means, it is still there, still inside, still keeping itself. The mountain knows you are here tonight, listening to this, paying attention in the dark. That matters. In whatever way the mountain measures what matters, it matters. You are part of the long chain of people who have sat in the dark and listened to stories about what is inside that mountain, and let the stories settle into them and carried them forward into sleep, and then into the next day, and then into the rest of their lives. Patricia Running Water heard the checking that August afternoon on the western slope, and she continued walking. She continued knowing. That is the instruction. Continue knowing. It costs nothing. It requires nothing special. It is simply a matter of letting the knowing stay, not letting it get crowded out by the relentless ordinariness of ordinary life. The mountain is still there. The sealed interior is still sealed. The question of what is inside is still unanswered, for now, by anything more specific than the weight of the evidence pointing inward. But you know about it now. You have spent these hours with it. You have felt, I hope, some fraction of the weight of the time involved, the scale of the mystery, the seriousness of the evidence. Carry it with you. Not as a fixed belief, not as a conviction, just as an open question. Just as the willingness to look at that mountain and think, there is something in there, something old, something that chose to go deep, something that is still waiting. That is enough. To know that the question is real is enough for tonight. The rest can wait. The mountain has been waiting for a very long time. It will wait a little longer while you sleep. Good night. Sleep well. The mountain will be there in the morning, white and vast and patient, emitting its warmth and its sound into the darkness, checking now and then whether anyone out here still knows what this place is. And someone does. Someone always does. There is one more long thread I want to pull on before we truly close this story, and it is a thread that connects everything we have discussed to the broadest possible frame. The question of what human civilization actually is, and whether our current understanding of it is missing something fundamental. We tend to think of civilization as a linear progression, small bands of hunter-gatherers gradually developing into settled agricultural societies, which gradually develop into complex hierarchical civilizations with cities and writing and specialization and all the markers that our current definition of civilization requires. In this model, the very early Americans, whoever they were and whenever they arrived, were necessarily near the beginning of that progression, sophisticated in their way, knowledgeable about their environment, but pre-civilizational in the technical sense. But this model assumes that the only kind of complexity that counts is the kind that leaves large-scale surface evidence. Cities, monuments, writing systems, hierarchical organization, the kinds of things that survive in the archaeological record because they were large enough and durable enough to persist through time. What if there were other kinds of complexity, other organizational forms that were equally sophisticated in their own terms, but that did not produce the kind of surface visible evidence that our current definition of civilization is built to recognize? A community of people who lived entirely or primarily underground in a thermally stable volcanic environment would not build pyramids or cities on the surface. They would not leave large-scale agricultural landscapes. They would not produce the kinds of material culture that wind up in museums. What they would produce is a highly specialized knowledge system adapted to their specific interior environment, transmitted through generations in forms that were appropriate to that environment. Oral tradition, acoustic practice, biological cultivation, the modification of cave surfaces in ways that served their informational and functional needs. From the surface, they would be nearly invisible. The only evidence of their existence would be in the anomalies their presence created in the geological and acoustic record of the mountain, and in the traditions of the surface peoples who had ongoing relationships with them, which is exactly what we find at Shasta. The absence of conventional archaeological evidence for an advanced pre-Columbian civilization in Northern California is not evidence that no advanced culture existed there. It may simply be evidence that the culture that existed there left its evidence in a place where conventional archaeological methods have not yet looked. This is an important epistemological point. Our definitions of what counts as civilization and our methods for finding it are both calibrated to the kind of civilization we already know about. Surface visible, large-scale, hierarchical, monumental. If a different kind of complexity existed, one that was interior and vertical, and organized around knowledge rather than material accumulation, we would not find it with the tools and the questions we currently use. We would need different questions, and we would need to take seriously the sources that might be pointing toward those questions. The geological anomalies that resist standard interpretation, the acoustic signatures that behave unlike volcanic geology, and the oral traditions of indigenous peoples that consistently describe something real and specific about the interior of this mountain. These are the different questions. They are not impossible to ask. They are not beyond the reach of current science. They simply require a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that disrupts established frameworks. Science at its best has always done this. The history of scientific progress is the history of following evidence into disruption. Heliocentrism disrupted the received understanding of the cosmos. Evolution disrupted the received understanding of human origins. Continental drift disrupted the received understanding of the solid Earth. In each case, the evidence pointed in a direction that the established frameworks resisted, and in each case following the evidence produced understanding that was both more accurate and more interesting than what it replaced. The evidence about Mount Shasta points in a direction that the established frameworks currently resist. But the resistance will not last indefinitely. Evidence is patient. Evidence accumulates, and eventually the weight of it becomes too great to maintain the resistance. We are not at the breaking point yet, but we are closer than we have ever been. Let us also discuss the role of the mountain in the lives of the people who live near it today, because the present is as much a part of this story as the past. The city of Mount Shasta, the small town that sits at the base of the mountain and takes its name from it, has a population of a few thousand people. It has a distinctive character among small towns in the American West. The usual industries are there: tourism, some timber, some agriculture, the service economy that supports outdoor recreation. But alongside these ordinary economic activities, the town has become something of a gathering point for people from across the country and around the world who feel drawn to the mountain in ways that they often find difficult to explain. Spiritual seekers, meditators, people who describe themselves as sensitive or as having gifts that the mainstream world does not validate. People who have had experiences near the mountain that they cannot categorize within their ordinary frameworks and that have brought them back, sometimes repeatedly, across years or decades. The local attitude toward these visitors is mixed, as you might expect. Some residents find the mystical tourism tiresome. Others have built economic relationships with it. Some find it genuinely interesting. A few are themselves among the people drawn to the mountain's unusual qualities. What is striking about the community of people who feel drawn to Shasta is that they are not, as a group, credulous or unreflective. Many of them are educated professionals. Many have tried the conventional explanations and found them unsatisfying, not because they want the mystery, but because the conventional explanations genuinely do not account for what they have experienced. They have felt something specific near this mountain, something that does not happen to them elsewhere, and they are not willing to simply explain it away as suggestion or altitude or wishful thinking. Many of them do not have specific beliefs about what the mountain contains. They simply know that something about it is different. They know that the difference is real, and they have organized their lives, to varying degrees, around the acknowledgement of that difference. In this, they are not unlike the indigenous peoples who have always known the mountain was different. The specific frameworks are vastly different. The underlying perception is the same. Something is there. Something that most places do not have. Something that produces consistent effects in the people who spend time near it. What is interesting is that the people who feel this most strongly are not usually the ones who have read all the literature about Lemurians and crystals and galactic centers. They are often people who arrived at the mountain with no particular expectations and found that the mountain met them with something they had not been prepared for. The raw experience, unmediated by prior framework, is often the most powerful and the most persistently influential. This raw experience, consistent across people with very different backgrounds, intentions, and frameworks, is data. It is not the same kind of data as a ground-penetrating radar survey, but it is data. It is evidence that the physical environment of this mountain produces reliable, reproducible effects in the human nervous system that most other environments do not produce. The source of those effects may be entirely explicable within the physics of infrasound and geology and mineral-specific air chemistry, but the effects themselves, the felt sense of something present and old and attending, are real and documented and consistent. And they are consistent with exactly what the geology and the oral traditions point toward. Something is there. Everyone who spends real time near the mountain, in the right areas, with any degree of openness to what the place produces, has a version of that thought. It is one of the most consistent things about Shasta, the consistency of the impression it makes on people who approach it without prior frameworks to impose on it. That consistency is the mountain's most reliable testimony, not the dramatic accounts, not the most extreme claims, the quiet, ordinary, consistent testimony of person after person after person who came to the mountain with no particular agenda and left knowing something they did not know before, knowing that this place is different, knowing that something is here. Let me now bring this to a different kind of close than the endings I have already offered, because I want to make sure the intellectual dimensions of this are as clear as the atmospheric ones. What we are dealing with at Mount Shasta is not a myth in the dismissive sense. It is not a story that people tell because they want the world to be more interesting than it is. It is a convergence of physical evidence, indigenous knowledge, and documented experience that points toward a specific empirical question. Does the interior of this mountain contain spaces and materials that bear evidence of very early human habitation? That question can be answered, not definitively by anything I have presented tonight, but in principle by the right investigation. And answering it matters enormously, because if the answer is yes, the implications ripple outward through every adjacent question in American archaeology, in human evolutionary biology, in the history of human knowledge systems, in our understanding of what complex culture looks like when it does not look like what we expect it to look like. We are at a moment in the history of these questions when the technology is available, the collaborative frameworks are developing, and the accumulated weight of indirect evidence is significant enough that the question cannot be responsibly ignored much longer. The investigation will happen. The evidence for it is too strong and the tools to pursue it are too well developed for it not to happen. What I hope for, listening to these stories and following these threads over many years, is that when the investigation happens, it is done correctly. That the tribal communities who have kept this knowledge alive are genuine partners, not consultants or informants or sources of local color, but genuine partners in the design and execution and interpretation of the research. That the knowledge they carry is treated as what it is, the most specific and most durable source of information about this place that exists. That the investigation respects the weight of what it is approaching and the span of time and care that has gone into protecting what it is looking for. And that whatever is found, whether it is the most extraordinary archaeological discovery in the history of the Americas or something more modest, it is understood in the full context of everything that has gone before it. The geological evidence and the acoustic evidence and the physical anomalies and the oral traditions and the brief, partial, often frustrating accounts of the people who got close and could not quite get close enough. All of that context is part of the finding, whatever the finding turns out to be. It is not background noise, it is evidence. Evidence that the investigation is warranted. Evidence that the question has been real and serious for a very long time. Evidence that this mountain deserves the attention that has been concentrated on it for as long as humans have been near enough to pay attention. The mountain has been the center of a story for longer than we know how to measure. The story is not over. It is still being told. You are part of the telling tonight, listening in the dark with the screen's soft light and the weight of all these words settling into you. and tomorrow the mountain will still be there, white on the horizon for those who are close enough to see it. Present in the knowledge of the people who carry the traditions about it. Present in the geological record that records its every change and every continuity. Present in the sealed interior, unchanged since it was sealed, waiting with the patience of something that has learned to wait across spans of time that make human impatience look like the blink of an eye. Something ancient is sealed beneath Mount Shasta. The evidence says so. The traditions say so. The geology says so in the particular language of thermal anomalies and acoustic signatures and GPR data that will not resolve cleanly into the categories the standard models provide. It is older than any civilization we currently recognize. It is older than the Olmec and the Carol and the earliest Andean complex cultures. It may be older than Göbekli Tepe. It may be older than the boundaries that our current understanding of human civilization is built around. And it is still there, sealed and patient and present, ready for the right question to be asked in the right way by the right people with the right partnerships and the right tools. We are almost ready. The mountain is waiting. And somewhere in the deep interior, past all the stone and the thermal water and the acoustic resonance and the infrasound that makes the hairs on your arms rise when you stand in certain places on the lower slope, something that has been in there for longer than we can fully hold in our minds is also waiting, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood, waiting to be received by a world that is finally almost ready to receive it. That is the story, as complete as I can tell it tonight, more complete than it has ever been told before, because the evidence is more complete than it has ever been before. And less complete than it will eventually be, when the investigation is done and the answer is in, we are between. That is where we are, between the evidence we have and the answer it points toward. Living in the question, carrying it with us into sleep and out the other side. The question is a good one to carry. It is serious and it is large, and it is connected to things that matter. The deep history of human presence in North America, the knowledge systems of the peoples who have lived here the longest, the nature of what we call civilization, and what other forms of complex culture might exist that we do not yet have the frameworks to recognize. It is a question worth carrying. Carry it tonight. Let it accompany you into sleep. Let the images of the mountain and the interior and the dark and the warmth and the waiting be the last images of the day. The mountain will be there when you wake. The question will still be open. The investigation will be one day closer to happening. And somewhere deep inside, in the sealed and patient dark, something continues. Something that chose to go there. Something that has always known how to wait. Good night. But I am not quite done. There is still something left to say, and it is the thing that has been underneath all of this from the very first word, the thing that none of the evidence, none of the oral traditions, and none of the geological surveys quite captures, but that everything is pointing toward. It is the feeling, not the infrasound-generated feeling of something watching, not the neurological effect of large underground resonance chambers on the vestibular system, not the atmospheric strangeness of being at altitude near volcanic thermal activity. All of those are real, and all of those contribute to what people experience near this mountain, but they are not the whole of it. The feeling that this place produces in people who spend real time there is not reducible to its physical components. It is something that emerges from all those components together, and from whatever those components point toward, the reality beneath the physics, the presence inside the mountain that the physics is the expression of. People who have spent time near Shasta and have felt that feeling tend to describe it in ways that are remarkably consistent. A sense of being at the edge of something, a sense that just beyond what they can perceive, just past the limit of what their senses can reach, something enormous and old is present, not threatening, not welcoming exactly, simply present, attending, there. The Wintu had a name for it, though the name has not fully survived in translation. What has survived is the description, the feeling that the mountain is remembering you, not seeing you, not watching you in the way a surveillance camera watches, but remembering you in the way that old places remember the people who have moved through them. A deep, slow, geological kind of memory that operates on different timescales than human memory, that has been accumulating for longer than any individual life, that registers your presence not as an event but as a continuation. You are not new to the mountain. Every person who has ever stood at its base has been part of what the mountain has been accumulating. Every footstep on its lower slopes, every fire lit in the forests below it, every voice that has spoken of it, sung about it, argued over its nature, tried to describe what it produces in those who come near. The mountain has received all of it, slowly, patiently, with the geological thoroughness that turns everything into stratum, everything into record, everything into part of the long accumulation that is what a mountain is. You are in that record now. You have been in it since you began to listen to this story. And when you close your eyes tonight and let sleep come, you will be in it still, registered. Part of the long list of those who knew about this place and paid attention to it and carried the question forward one more night. That is not mystical. That is just what attention is and what mountains are, taken together. Attention directed at a place is a real thing. It has real effects in the world. It changes what we know and what we do and what the place means in the network of human knowledge and human story. By listening to this, you have added your attention to the mountain's accumulation. You have registered your presence in the continuing record of this place, in the way that any act of knowing registers itself in the world it knows. The mountain is not indifferent. Not because it is supernatural, because nothing that has been attended to by conscious beings for as long as this mountain has been attended to is simply indifferent. It is saturated with knowledge, with story, with the weight of all that attention across all that time, and in the interior, whatever has been sealed and waiting, it is saturated too, with the specific knowledge of that interior, with the specific practices of however many generations maintained it, with the specific memory of the moment it was closed, and what was known at that moment, and what was hoped for, and what was feared, and what was trusted to the stone, and the dark, and the patient waiting. All of that is in there. The record of a relationship between people and a place that lasted longer than any relationship we currently have records of. The physical and informational product of tens of thousands of years of intimate knowledge of a specific environment, waiting in the dark, patient as stone, as warm as the thermal springs that run through the same interior. The mountain knows you are listening. And in whatever way listening to this story changes how you move through the world, even slightly, even just by adding one more thread to the understanding that something ancient and sealed and real exists beneath the Northern California sky, the mountain has been served by your attention. That is enough. That has always been enough. The people who kept this knowledge alive through catastrophe after catastrophe did not do so by proving it, or publishing it, or getting anyone to believe it. They did it by continuing to know it, by refusing to let the knowing be crowded out, by telling the stories in the dark when no one outside the circle was listening, and trusting that the knowing would persist as long as one person was there to carry it. You are there now, one more person in the long chain, one more night when the story was told and received and carried forward. The mountain is grateful. In whatever way a mountain is grateful, which is a slow and geological way and not necessarily recognizable as gratitude from the outside, but real. In the way that all of this is real, underneath and behind and beyond all the arguments about evidence and explanation and what counts as proof. Real in the deepest way. The way things are real that have been real for longer than memory can reach. Let that reality settle into you as sleep settles into you, slowly, from the outside in, from the surface down to whatever depths are in you. The way the mountain goes from white at the top to forested below to dark inside, deeper than any light from outside can reach. You are at the surface. The knowing is going down past the story and the evidence and the questions and the theories, past all the words and the analysis and the threads pulled and the anomalies noted and the traditions recounted, down to the simple, quiet, fundamental fact. Something is in there. It has been in there for a very long time. And now you know about it. Carry that knowing gently. It is not a burden. It is a light, small and warm, the way the thermal springs are warm in the cold morning of the mountain, the way the light from the stone in the Wintu tradition was warm in the dark of the interior. Carry it and let it accompany you into sleep and into tomorrow and into wherever the story takes you next. The mountain is still there. The sealed interior is still sealed. The question is still open, and the investigation is still coming, and the people who have never stopped knowing are still knowing, and the mountain is still checking now and then whether anyone out here is still paying attention. Tonight you paid attention. That matters. In the long record of this place, in the long accumulation of all the attention that has ever been directed at it, your attention is now part of the record. Small, quiet, one more thread in an incomprehensibly long weaving, but real and counted, and part of the continuing story of a mountain that has been at the center of a human story for longer than we know how to say. Good night. Sleep long and well. Let the mountain be present at the edge of your dreaming, white and vast and patient, and let whatever is inside it be present too, deep in the warm dark, still knowing how to wait, still keeping whatever it has always kept, still ready for the question that is almost ready to be asked. Almost. One more night, one more thread, one more person who knows. Almost. Before we truly go, let me say one more thing. About you, specifically. You have listened to this for a very long time tonight. Hours. You came here in the dark, or in the half-light, looking for something to accompany you into sleep. You came, maybe, without knowing exactly why this topic called to you. Maybe the word ancient pulled you. Maybe the word sealed. Maybe the word civilization, or the word mystery, or simply the image of a white mountain rising out of the Northern California sky. Whatever brought you here, you stayed. Through all the geological evidence and the acoustic anomalies and the oral traditions and the fragments of barely documented history, and the researchers who got close and turned back, and the hydrogeologist who felt the drill string drop into a finished space, you stayed through all of it. That means something. Not about you in particular, not as a judgment or an assessment. It means something about the kind of attention that this story rewards. A long, patient, open kind of attention. The kind that does not need the mystery resolved to be satisfied. The kind that can hold the question without collapsing it into a premature answer. That kind of attention is rarer than it should be. The world we live in is not built to cultivate it. Everything moves fast and demands resolution and rewards the quick take over the long consideration. But the important things, the genuinely deep things, require the long consideration. They reveal themselves slowly, to attention that is willing to stay. The way the thermal springs on Shasta's lower slopes reveal themselves to someone who is walking slowly and paying attention to what the ground is doing beneath their feet, rather than moving toward a predetermined destination. You have been paying that kind of attention tonight, and the story has tried to be worthy of it. Whether it succeeded is for you to judge. What you take away from this is your own. The specific things that landed hardest, the specific threads that feel most alive to you, the specific moments where the evidence produced a shift in how the question felt, all of that is yours. No two people listening to the same long story take away the same story. The story that lives in you after tonight is the one made from the intersection of everything I have said and everything you brought to the listening. That story is yours. Carry it however it needs to be carried. And the mountain will still be there, in the north of California, rising white and vast above the forests, emitting its warmth and its sound and its patient attention into the surrounding world, sealed inside by something that knew how to wait. It will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for a very long time to come. Good night. Thank you for listening all the way through. Thank you for the long patience of it. That patience is its own kind of knowing, its own kind of contribution to the continuing story. The mountain is real. What is inside is real. The question is real. And the people who have never stopped carrying the knowledge of it are real. Still here, still knowing, still ready. We are almost there. Almost. One more thing. Because there is always one more thing when the story is this old and this deep. In all of history, in all the thousands of years that humans have been telling stories about sacred mountains and sealed interiors and ancient keepers of ancient knowledge, the stories have never been told to an empty room. They have always been told to someone sitting in the dark or near a fire or in a circle of people who knew each other, or to a single stranger who happened to be passing through. Someone who received the story and was changed by it, in however small a way, and who carried some fragment of the change forward into whatever came next. The story of Mount Shasta has been told in exactly this way, for a very long time, by people sitting near fires on the lower slopes of the mountain, watching the snow on the summit catch the last light of day, by elders and teachers and knowledge holders who knew they were passing something irreplaceable to younger people who might not fully understand it yet but who would one day, by researchers and explorers and investigators who found themselves, to their own surprise, sitting with a question they could not dismiss and a story they could not fully account for. Tonight the story was told to you, in the dark, through a screen, across whatever distance separates the place where I made this from the place where you are listening. The story continues, as it has always continued, as it will continue after tonight, when you sleep and when you wake, and when you go about the ordinary business of your ordinary life, carrying somewhere in you the knowledge that something ancient is sealed inside a mountain in Northern California, and that the people who have always known about it, have never stopped knowing, and that the investigation that will finally answer the question is closer than it has ever been. Carry it well. It is a good thing to carry. One of the more interesting and more important things available to be carried in the world right now. The mountain is waiting. The interior is sealed. The question is open, and you know about it now. Sleep well. And if the story stayed with you, if some part of you is still on the lower slopes of that mountain listening for the sound that comes through the rock at certain hours, do not dismiss that. It is not a symptom of credulity. It is a symptom of appropriate attention, the kind of attention the mountain has always rewarded in the people willing to bring it. Thank you for being here. For all of this time, for all of this listening, the mountain remembers. There is a final observation I want to leave you with, one that comes not from the evidence, but from the experience of spending time with this story. When you sit with a genuine mystery long enough, something shifts. The need to resolve it softens. The need to declare it impossible softens too. What remains is something more valuable than either resolution or dismissal. The willingness to let the question be large. To let it be as large as it actually is. To let the span of time it describes be as long as it actually is. To let the people who have carried this knowledge deserve the respect that people deserve when they have kept something important alive against every pressure to let it go. The Wintu are still here. The Karuk are still here. The knowledge is still being carried. The mountain is still there. That is the most important fact in this entire story. Not the geological anomalies, though they are real. Not the acoustic signatures, though they are documented. Not the brief and half-documented physical encounters that the historical record preserves, though they are consistent and persuasive. The most important fact is that people have never stopped knowing about this place. Through everything, the knowing has never gone out. The fire, in that specific sense, is still burning. And as long as it is burning, the possibility of understanding what it illuminates remains. The possibility of the right investigation done, in the right partnership, producing the right answer remains. One night at a time. One listener at a time. One more person in the chain who now knows. Good night. Truly this time. The mountain will be there in the morning, white and patient and full of something ancient that has learned how to wait. Let it wait a little longer while you sleep.